Hey there and welcome back. If you have arrived here tonight a little worn down by the day, a little chilled, ready to set the entirety of it aside and be somewhere kinder for a few hours, then you are exactly where you ought to be, and you can let your shoulders drop now. Tonight is one of those deepening winter evenings that asks almost nothing of you. It is for anyone who has ever stepped in out of the weather and felt the relief of a warm chamber close around them. Anyone who knows in their bones what it is to simply want to be snug. I am going to take you somewhere to find that warmth, about 150 years back, into the heart of a house that has arranged its entire day around the keeping out of winter. You need do nothing but lie still and let this present season loosen its grip. Let the year slip backwards, and as it goes, hold one picture in your mind. In the building we are travelling towards, long before anyone else has stirred, a single person is already awake in the freezing black, kneeling at a dead and lightless grate, and everything that will make this home snug by nightfall begins with her. Before we go in, there is one thing I would like to do. I always like to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, what country, what city, what hour it happens to be where you are, and whether the cold is pressing at your own window or whether you are somewhere the winter never truly arrives. Wherever you find yourself, you are very welcome to leave it below. I look through them, and I like knowing who is here with me. And if these slow evenings are the sort of thing you would like to find your way back to, you are always welcome to subscribe, with no hurry in it and no pressure at all. Think of it only as leaving a door open so that the next time the nights draw close and you want somewhere warm to go, you will already know the way back. Picture this. It is a little before 5 o'clock on a January morning in the 1870s, and the building is at the very floor of its night. Nothing moves. The street outside lies under a hard black frost, the kind that has been tightening since midnight, and each chimney along the terrace stands freezing and smokeless against a sky that has not yet thought about dawn. Inside, the chambers hold the particular chill of a place where each grate has been let die. The heat the family banked up the evening before has long since drained away through the brick and the glass and the gaps under the doors, and what remains is a chill that has settled in to stay. The frost of furniture and floorboards and still air that has not been disturbed for hours. This is the hour the household never sees, and it is the truest measure of what they were up against. Come with me into it, quietly, while the household is still asleep. Stand for a moment in the front hall and let your eyes adjust. There is just enough grey at the fanlight over the door to show you the shape of matters. The long-case clock against the wall ticking on into the gloom. The stone flags underfoot that have given up the last of yesterday's heat. The air in here has a taste to it, faintly of soot and yesterday's coal smoke, and the raw mineral smell of stone in the freeze months. If you laid your palm flat against the wall, it would be like touching the outside of the household brought indoors. The whole building, 4 stories of brick from the basement kitchen to the attic where the servants sleep, has become, in these small hours, very nearly the same temperature as the frozen street. And it will take the better part of the morning to undo that. Go up the stairs. In the parlour on the first floor, where the family sat late into the previous evening, the grate is a study in abandonment. The fire that burned there at 10 o'clock is now a heap of fine grey ash, with a few blackened cinders riding on top, utterly without heat, and the marble of the chimney-piece around it is as chill as a gravestone. The curtains are drawn, heavy matters of wool rep that did their work for as long as the hearth lasted and now simply hang, holding the dead air in. On the round table the lamp has been turned out and capped. The piano stands shut. Every object in the chamber, the spines of the books, the brass of the fender, the porcelain on the mantel shelf, carries the same even coldness, so that there is no warm thing anywhere to move toward, no last ember of ease. The room has reverted, overnight, to being merely a box of raw air with furniture in it. The bedrooms above are colder still, and this is the one thing that surprises people most about a house like this. We imagine the Victorian snug, and in the right room at the right hour they were, but warmth in this dwelling is not a property of the building. It is an event that has to be made, fire by fire, and at 5 in the morning no hearth has been made anywhere for 7 hours. In the principal bedroom, the master and mistress lie under a considerable architecture of bedclothes, a feather mattress beneath them, and over them blankets and an eiderdown and a counterpane, with a nightcap on each head and the hangings of the bed half drawn. And inside that nest they are snug enough. But the air of the space around them is bitterly raw. On the washstand the water in the ewer has a skin of ice across it. If either of them were to put a bare foot to the floor, it would be like stepping onto frozen slate. The fashionable preference of the age was for a bedroom kept frank and bracing, the window cracked an inch even now for the sake of the night air, and the result is that the space between the heated bed and the frosted glass is a small Arctic. The sleepers have learned never to cross until someone has come to mend the hearth. Today, look at the windows themselves, because they tell the entire story of the night. On the inside of the glass, the frost has been at work for hours, and it has drawn across each pane the strange branching shapes that the period called frost ferns, whole forests of them, fronds and feathers and palm leaves of ice grown not on the outside where the weather is but on the inside, fed by the breath and the damp of the chamber freezing against the single thin sheet of frozen glass. They are beautiful, and they are a warning. They mean the space has surrendered. They mean the boundary between indoors and out, which a hearth fire holds back all evening, has thinned in the night to almost nothing, and that the winter's come in as far as it can reach. Down in the basement it is a degree or two less hostile, because the kitchen is below the level of the frost, and because the great range against the far wall is never quite allowed to go out entirely. But even there, the grate has been damped down to the merest sullen red, banked under a blanket of small coal and ash, so that it will keep alive until morning without burning fuel, and the heat it gives off now would not heat a teacup. The scullery beyond is frankly freezing, the stone sink rimed, the lead pipe brings the water stopped solid where it runs along the outside wall. That frozen pipe was no small matter, for the cold did not only chill the building, it could cut off its water altogether. The pipes that brought water in ran along frozen walls and through icy yards, and in a hard frost they froze solid. The water in them turned to ice, so that a turn of the tap in the scullery gave nothing at all, and the household woke to find itself not only freezing, but waterless, unable to fill a kettle or a can or a basin until the thaw or until the frozen length of pipe could be coaxed back to running with hot cloths and patience. In the cisterns that stored the household's water, a skin of ice formed on the top, and for the poor of the city the freezing of the water was a harder blow still, for many of them drew their water not from a pipe of their own, but from a shared standpipe or pump in the court or the road, turned on for only an hour or two a day, and when the frost sealed it they queued and waited and went without, carrying what little they could get back through the chill in a pail. The winter that froze the family's bedroom ewer froze the city's water in its pipes, and the getting of water, that we turn a tap for without a thought, became in a hard frost one more raw labour to be reckoned with. The whole apparatus of the dwelling, each hearth and flue and boiler that exists to throw out heat, sits idle and stone frost in the black, like an orchestra before anyone has come to play it. And this is the condition each frozen morning began from. Not a thermostat to nudge, not a switch to throw, but a house returned overnight to the temperature of the weather, and a deliberate labour ahead to win it back. The warmth that the family will take for granted by 10 o'clock, the heated drawing room and the hot water and the glowing nursery, does not arrive. It is manufactured from raw and ash and raw coal by human hands beginning in the unlit dark. Somewhere below us, in a narrow bed in a frozen attic, the first of those hands is about to be woken by an alarm she set in her own head before she slept. Let us go and find her, because the warm day starts at her cold fingertips. Her name does not matter to history, and she would not expect it to, but her mourning matters to us a great deal, because she is the one who turns the dead house back into a living one. She is the housemaid, perhaps 19 years old, and she wakes in the black before any light, in the coldest room in the building, under the slope of the roof. There is no lit grate up here, and there never will be. She dresses fast, with the particular speed of someone dressing in genuine frozen, pulling her clothes on over her shift while still half under the blanket, and she goes down the back stairs in the gloom, with a box of matches and a candle end, her breath smoking ahead of her, to begin the part of the day that the family is specifically arranged never to witness. The first grate she kneels at is the dining room, because the family must come down to a warm breakfast and the chamber takes time to heat. What she does there she will repeat, with variations, at grate after grate through the morning, and it is worth watching once, slowly, because it is one of the genuinely skilled and genuinely thankless labours of the age. She kneels on the hearth with a coarse apron over her dress, and a box of housemaid's matters beside her, and first she must deal with yesterday. The grate is full of fine ash and dead clinker, and all of it has to come out, raked down through the bars into the pan below and carried away, with the fine ash rising as she works and settling on her fingers and her apron and the back of her throat. A careless maid fills the space with drifting grey. A good one wets the ash a little, or moves with a slowness that keeps it down. Either way, she is filthy to the wrist within minutes, and the day has barely begun. Then the black leading, which is the part that would astonish us most. The cast iron of the grate, all those handsome bars and the decorated back plate, will rust and dull if it is left, and fashion demanded that it gleam a deep gunmetal black each single day. So the maid takes up her brushes and a paste called black lid, a mixture of graphite that comes as a block or a powder, and she works it over each iron surface with one brush and then polishes it off with another, and then with a third, buffing the metal up to a soft dark shine. It is heavy, dirty, repetitive work done on the knees in a frozen room, and it has to be finished before the coals is even lit, because once the hearth is in you, cannot black lead a hot grate. At the time she is done, her fingers are black to the elbow, and she has not yet produced a single degree of snugness. It is worth dwelling before she strikes her light on how recent and how precious that easy flame in her hand actually was. Within living memory there had been no such thing as a match. To make fire, within the lifetime of the older servants, had meant the tinderbox, and the tinderbox was a small daily labour all its own, a flint, a curved steel struck against it, and a box of tinder, which was charred linen or scorched cloth saved for the purpose, over which the sparks were knocked until one caught and glowed, and which was then coaxed with breath and a sulphur-tipped splint into an actual flame. On a fine dry day, a practised hand might raise a light in a minute or two. On a raw damp morning, with the tinder gone soft and the flint sullen, it could take many minutes of striking and blowing to win a single flame, and many a cold kitchen had waited shivering on a reluctant spark. The friction match had swept all that away within a generation, and to a young woman kneeling at a grate, it must still have seemed something close to magic, this little splint that gave fire at a stroke, that they were called lucifers, and congreves, and other names besides, and they were not without their dangers. The early ones flared and spat and stank of the sulphur and phosphorus that armed their tips. They could take light in the pocket or the box, and the poor souls who made them in their thousands in the match factories paid a terrible price in their health for the phosphorus they worked with. But to the household they were simple deliverance, fire on demand, and the maid who struck one without a thought to light her morning grate was using a convenience her own grandmother would have marvelled at. Now at last, the flames itself. She lays it the way each maid was taught to lay it, in strict order from the bottom up, and the order is not decoration. It is the difference between a good fire that catches and a wasted morning. First, twists and sheets of yesterday's newspaper, screwed up loosely so the air can move through. On the paper, a criss-cross cage of dry kindling, thin splints of wood that the household buys in bundles, or that a boy has chopped from old boxes. On the kindling, the smaller coals picked from the scuttle, the cinders saved and riddled from yesterday's ash, because nothing in this home is wasted, and only then, propped carefully so as not to smother everything, the fresh lumps of coal, she strikes her match, one of the new sulphur matches that the age called lucifers, and there is the small sharp hiss and the stink of the striking, and she holds the flame to the paper in 3 or 4 places along the front. For a moment, nothing. Then the paper catches and flares, a quick yellow leap of light that throws her shadow huge and trembling up the black wall behind her, and the kindling begins to tick and spit as it dries and takes. This is the delicate minute, the minute each hearth can still die in, and she watches it the way you watch something alive. If the chimney is drawing well, the flame leans inward and upward and pulls. If it is sulky, she may kneel and blow, or work the bellows, or hold a sheet of newspaper across the opening to force the cold current up the flue, a trick that could pull a roaring fire out of nothing, and could, if you forgot it for 30 seconds, set the paper alight in your hands. She does not forget. She has done this several hundred times. The kindling crackles into a proper blaze, the first real warmth of the day rising into the chamber, and the smaller coals begin to glow at their edges and then to burn, and she sits back on her heels for a single moment in the orange light, the one heated spot in the entire frozen house, and then she gets up, gathers her black and dirty matters, and carries them through to do it all again in the breakfast room and the master's dressing room and the parlour, and on, a dozen times before the family has so much as turned over in bed. There was an order to her round, learned and fixed, and it was governed by where the family would go first and how long each chamber took to warm. The dining room came early, because the family would come down to it, and a cold breakfast was a poor welcome. The master's dressing room was got going before he woke. The chambers they would not reach till later could wait their turn. She moved through the building in this set sequence, grate after grate, judging her time so that each grate would be burning well at the hour it was wanted, and no fuel was wasted heating a space before its hour, and all of it had to be finished, the lighting and the carrying and the tending before the family stirred, so that they should come down into a house already warming, and never see the frozen dark labour that had made it so. The art of good service was in part the art of invisibility, of having the ease ready and the raw work done and out of sight before anyone rose to enjoy it. Out in the thoroughfare, if you went to the window now and looked, you would see the first thin thread of pale smoke beginning to rise from the chimney of this dwelling, and then from the one next door, and the one beyond that, as maid after maid the length of the terrace kneels at her own first grate and coaxes her own first flame, until the road is breathing smoke into the unlit dark, and the great daily business of a city keeping itself warm has quietly begun. That smoke matters, and we will come back to where it goes and what it does to the sky. But for now, simply notice the beautiful and brutal fact at the centre of this home. Its warmth has a human source. It does not come from anywhere except a young woman's freezing and capable hands, and it begins, each day of each winter, in the gloom, while she works her way through the upstairs grates, go down past her, all the way to the basement, because there is one hearth in this dwelling that does not begin from scratch and never quite goes out, and it is the engine the household turns upon. In the kitchen, set into what was once an open hearth and is now bricked snugly around it, stands the range, the great black iron presence that the Victorians sometimes called the Kitchener. And to understand how this home stays snug and fed, you have to understand this object first, because it is doing more jobs at once than anything else in the building. A century before, a kitchen like this would have cooked at a coal fire, with meat turning on a spit and the glow roaring up the chimney, and the cook roasting on one side and shivering on the other. The range was the great improvement on all that. It is a closed iron box of a business, with the firebox in the centre behind a grate of its own, an oven built into the brickwork on one side, and sometimes a second oven or a warming cupboard on the other, an iron hot plate across the top with removable rings and, crucially, a boiler set against the coals on the further side that holds water and keeps it hot. One contained fire, banked and fed and regulated by dampers that the cook learns to judge like an instrument, heats the ovens for baking and roasting, heats the plates and the rings on top for the pots, and heats the water that will be drawn off all day for washing the family, the dishes, the floors and the clothes. It is a stove, an oven and a water heater fused into a single mass of iron, and it earns the glow of the kitchen as a side effect of everything else it does. The kitchen maid is down before the cook, and her first task is the range, because nothing in the kitchen can happen until it is roaring. She rakes out the firebox, much as the housemaid rakes the grates above, clears the flues of yesterday's soot with a little rake kept for the purpose, because a range choked with soot will not draw and will not bring its ovens evenly to temperature. And then she builds the flames up from the banked red core that was kept alive overnight, feeding it small coal and then larger, until the iron begins to tick and creak as it expands, and a strong glow comes off the front of it, that you can feel from across the space. Within an hour, the great mass of metal has changed from cold to genuinely fierce, the kind of the glow that reddens a face and dries the air, and the kitchen, which was merely chill at 5 o'clock, becomes the first properly snug room in the entire house. To work that range well was a real and undervalued skill, and the cook who ruled the kitchen had learned it over years. There was no dial to set, no number to trust. The readiness of the ovens had to be judged by hand and by instinct, by holding an arm inside to feel how long the skin could bear it, by the colour of a scrap of paper or a scatter of flour browning on the floor of the oven, by the accumulated knowledge of how this particular iron beast behaved when the wind was in this particular quarter. The dampers that governed the moving air were the cook's instrument, open to drive the hearth hotter for a roast, closed to hold a steady, gentle warmth for a slow braise or to keep the ovens fit for pastry, and a careless hand on them meant a burned joint or a sodden cake or a hearth fire that sulked and would not heat at all. The range demanded feeding and riddling and minding all day long. The firebox kept exactly right. The flues kept clear of the soot that would choke its warmth, and it gave back, along with the cooking and the hot water, a relentless, dry, scorching warmth that the cook laboured in from morning to night, red-faced and damp in summer, grateful enough for it in the depths of January, but never, in any season, free of it. This is one of the quiet ironies of a place like this, and it is worth sitting with. The warmest room in a comfortable Victorian house is almost never the one the family lives in. It is the kitchen down in the basement where the servants work, because the kitchen holds the one grate that burns from before dawn until late at night without pause. Upstairs the family's hearths are lit, burn for a stretch, and are let out again when the chamber empties. Their heat is occasional, scheduled, a business turned on and off as the household moves through the chambers. The range is constant. By mid-morning the cook is working in a heat she will complain about all summer and be grateful for in January, the boiler beside the grate ticking and singing as the water inside it climbs toward scalding, and a kettle almost always somewhere on the hot plate edging toward the boil. That hot water is its own small revolution, and you only grasp how much so by remembering what it replaces. There is no tap in this dwelling that gives hot water. There is no system of pipes carrying heat to the bedrooms. There is this one iron boiler beside this one kitchen hearth, and each drop of hot water used anywhere in the building, to wash the master's face, to fill the children's bath, to scald the breakfast dishes, to make the tea, has to be drawn off here in a can or a jug, and physically carried by a maid up however many flights of stairs the destination requires. The range makes the hot water. Human legs distribute it. We will follow one of those cans of hot water up the stairs later, when the family begins to wake, and you will feel the weight of it. For now, stand a moment in the snug kitchen and take in what the range has made. The cold scullery beyond is beginning to thaw. The cat has come from somewhere to lie against the warm iron base. In winter the range did one more job that we should not pass over, for it was the only place in the household where the washing could be got dry. Laundry was a heavy labour at the best of times, but in the dead season, with no drying ground to be had outside in the frost and damp and the smuts of the foggy air, the wet washing came back indoors to be dried at the kitchen hearth, and the kitchen and scullery in the days after a wash were festooned with it, the clothes horse drawn up before the range hung with steaming sheets and shirts, lines strung across the warm chamber, the air thick with the damp warmth of drying linen. The range that cooked the dinner and heated the water dried the household's clothes as well, throwing its glow into the wet wool and cotton hung all around it, and the snug kitchen in the raw air months smelt as often of drying laundry as of cooking. The one great fire of the building pressed into yet another of the endless services it performed. There is a smell building of hot metal and coal, and soon of the first cooking. The whole machine of the day, the breakfast that must go up, the bread that must bake, the gallons of hot water the morning will demand. All of it depends on this single banked fire having been kept alive through the night and woken before light, so that when the rest of the building is still rimed with frost there is already down here in the basement a fierce reliable heat, and a kettle moving quietly toward the boil. Everything else is going to be hauled up out of this chamber. Before we go back up to the waking family, follow the business all these grates are eating, because none of this comfort exists without it, and the getting of it shaped the household, the thoroughfare, the city, and the very sky overhead. The answer is coal, and a house like this devours it. Every grate the maid lit this morning, the range that has been burning since before dawn, the hearths that will be kept going in 5 or 6 chambers through the day, all of them are fed from the same black mineral, and a comfortable family in a town in the dead season might burn through a ton of it in a fortnight, without thinking the business remarkable. The coal came from far away, and it came because of the railways. A generation or two earlier, the coal that warmed a town like this travelled mostly by sea, dug from the great fields of the northeast around Newcastle, and shipped down the coast in collier brigs to be unloaded at the wharves, which is why Londoners called it sea coal long after much of it had stopped arriving by sea. By the 1870s the railways had changed everything. Coal came down from the pits of the North and the Midlands in endless trains of wagons into the coal yards beside the city stations, and from there it was carted through the streets to the cellars of houses exactly like this one. The price of being warm had fallen, and the amount a household burned had risen to match, and the smoke of all that burning had become the defining fact of the winter air. But we will come to the smoke. Watch how the coal actually arrives, because it is one of the small dramas of the road. The coalman comes with his cart and his heavy horse, and the coal is delivered not through the household but through the pavement, set into the flagstones in front of the building, often you can still find them in old streets today, is a round iron cover, the coal hole, and beneath it a chute or a simple drop into the coal cellar that lies under the front pavement in the vault between the household and the thoroughfare. The coalman heaves his sacks from the cart, each one 100 weight, swings them onto his leather-padded shoulder and back, lifts the iron plate, and tips the coal roaring down into the black of the cellar, a sound that anyone who lived in such a street would know at once, a lengthy rushing rumble under the soles of passers-by, and a cloud of black dust rising from the hole into the raw air. There was a careful watch kept on the delivery, for coal was money, and a sack short was money lost. The coal came by weight, in 100-weight sacks, and a prudent householder or a sharp cook counted the sacks, tipped down the hole, and knew how many made the ton ordered, for the trade had its dishonest corners, and a short delivery or a wetted, slate-laced sack was an old complaint. The full sacks went down with their long rushing roar, and the empties came up flat over the coalman's shoulder, and the count was kept, and the cellar filled by the hour against the lengthy burning of the winter, and the price of it all entered in the household books, where coal stood as one of the heaviest of the winter expenses, a steady draining cost that ran on for as long as the coal did. He is one of the genuinely hard-labouring figures of the winter city, black from head to foot, carrying half a ton at a time up from a cart on his own back, and he does it house after house, street after street, all the short, bitter day. Down in that cellar the coal sits in a great heap in the gloom, and the household's whole winter of comfort is measured by how high it stands against the wall. It is the kitchen maid's job, or the boy's if there is one, to go down with the scuttle and fill it from the heap, and to haul it up, and this is the start of a chain of lifting and carrying that never really stops. The coal scuttle itself is one of the objects you would notice in each chamber, a metal pail, sometimes a handsome brass or copper one in the parlour polished up like ornament, sometimes a plain Japan tin one in the back spaces, but always there, beside each hearth, holding the next hour's fuel, with a little shovel hooked over its side. Not all coal was the same, and a well-run house knew the difference and bought accordingly. The best coal came in large clean lumps, the round coals, or best house coals that burned bright and long and were kept for the parlour and the drawing-room where the grate was on show and the family sat. Below that came the smaller coals and the nuts for the everyday grates and the kitchen, and at the bottom the slack, the small coal and dust, cheap and dirty, invaluable for banking a good fire down to smoulder overnight, but poor for burning bright. A careful mistress ordered her coal by the ton in the autumn, while it was cheaper, and laid in her winter's supply in the cellar under the pavement, and so paid the lowest price and never ran short in a hard spell. That advantage of buying in bulk was one that only the comfortable enjoyed, and it points to one of the quiet injustices of ease in this age. The poor could not lay in a ton. They bought their coal in tiny quantities as they could afford it, 100 weight, or a half, or even a few pounds at a time scooped into a bucket from the corner chandler's shop, and they paid, pound for pound, a far higher price for it than the man who bought by the cartload, so that warmth, like so much else, cost the poor more and the wealthy less. In the bitterest weeks of winter, when the price of coal rose and the work grew scarce, the choice between coal and food was a real one in many a household, and the warm cellar under this comfortable house, stacked high with its season's supply, was itself a kind of riches. A blaze is hungry. It must be fed each little while, a few fresh lumps placed on with the tongs or shovelled on as it burns down, and so each lit room must have its scuttle, and each scuttle must be carried down empty and up full, by hand, from the cellar under the road. So when you sit, later tonight, in the warm parlour with the family, remember the geography of that warmth. It was dug by men in the Black 100 and more miles north, hauled south in a train, carted to the door, tipped roaring through a hole in the pavement into a black cellar, shovelled into a pail, and brought up the stairs on a young person's arm to be laid, lump by lump, onto a blaze that someone else had knelt to light. There was nothing automatic in any of it. Coal was the cheap, abundant, miraculous fuel that made the Victorian city possible and made this kind of snugness ordinary, and each warm hour the family enjoyed had this long black supply line standing behind it, ending always in somebody bending to lift a load. The warmth was real. It was simply never free, and never without weight. Now come back up into the dwelling, where the dining room fire, the maid lit an hour ago, has taken proper hold, and stand in front of it, because the fireplace itself, the entire arrangement of iron and marble and brass that frames a Victorian fire, is worth looking at as the centrepiece it was always meant to be. A room in this period was built and furnished to face the hearth the way a later room would be arranged to face a screen. The hearth was the heart, the focus in the old and literal sense of that word, and everything around it, the chimney piece, the fender, the irons, the rug, the chairs, was an apparatus for making the most of it. Begin with the grate set into the opening. The age of the great open wood blaze was long gone. Coal burns differently, and it needs to be held up in a basket of iron bars so that air can reach it from below and the ash can fall away. So the coal sits in a register grate, a neat iron firebox raised off the hearth, its bars holding the burning coals in a glowing wall at about the height of your knee, and behind and around it, the cast iron is shaped and often decorated with a movable plate, the register itself, that can be adjusted to control how much air the chimney pulls. A well-set coal fire in a good grate is a different creature from a log fire. It burns hotter and steadier and more contained, a dense red and orange mass that throws a fierce direct heat straight out into the space, and it asks for that careful tending, a few coals at a time, that kept the scuttle always at hand. Around the opening rises the chimney piece, and in a comfortable room like this it is the grandest object in the place. It might be marble white or veined grey, or a dark polished slate made to imitate marble, carved with a simple architecture of columns and a shelf, the mantelpiece across the top. That shelf is itself a small stage. On it stand the clock in the centre, almost always a clock, flanked by a pair of ornaments or vases or candlesticks arranged in the strict symmetry the age loved, and above the shelf, very often, a large mirror in a gilt frame, the overmantel, which served the double purpose of throwing the firelight and the lamplight back into the chamber, and of making the fireplace tower up as the obvious centre of attention. A Victorian sitting room with the embers lit and the lamps going and the overmantel glass catching all of it was a deliberately glittering thing, and the hearth was the sun it all revolved around. At the foot of it sits the working ironmongery, and this is where the daily life of the hearth actually happened. Across the front of the hearth stands the fender, a low guard of brass or steel that keeps the coals and the falling cinders from rolling out onto the floor and the rug. And in a smart room it is kept polished to a gold gleam. Standing in the fender or in a rack beside it is the set of fire irons, and each household had them, the poker for breaking up the burning mass and letting air into it, the tongs for lifting individual coals on and placing them just so, and the shovel for feeding on the small coal and for clearing the ash. To tend a blaze well with these was a small domestic art, and you could tell a great deal about a person, the Victorians believed, by how they handled a poker, whether they nursed a blaze patiently or attacked it and sent the snugness roaring uselessly up the flue. And a blaze could turn on you. The great affliction of the open hearth, the one thing that could make a handsome fireplace a daily misery, was the smoking chimney, and scarcely a house of the period was wholly free of it. A flue that did not draw cleanly, whether through a fault in its building, a narrowing of soot, a chimney pot wrongly shaped, or simply a wind blowing across the top in the wrong direction and pressing the smoke back down, would send its smoke not up and away, but out into the space, in slow grey gusts and curls that stung the eyes and caught the throat, and laid a film of soot over everything, and drove the family coughing toward the door. A smoking chimney on a wild, bitter night, when the wind backed and gusted over the pots and beat the smoke down the flue, was one of the genuine torments of the season, the choice being between a smoking chimney and no hearth at all, in the raw cold. The age waged a campaign against it. There were chimney pots of each cunning shape, and revolving cowls set spinning by the wind to keep the through draught drawing the right way, and adjustable plates set into the throat of the flue, and there were men who made a living as so-called smoke doctors, called in to diagnose and cure an obstinate smoking chimney, as a physician might be called to a patient. Sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they did not, and many a family simply learned to live with a flue that smoked when the wind sat in the east, and watched the weathercock with a particular dread on a windy night, knowing what their evening hearth would do to them. And on the floor before all of it lies the hearth rug, a thick rug set down on the bare boards or over the carpet directly in front of the coals, partly to protect the floor from sparks, and partly to mark out the warmest and most favoured ground in the entire room. To stand on the hearthrug with your back to the flames was the most comfortable place a body could be in the freeze months, and it was also, by long custom, the place of the master of the building, who would plant himself there before dinner and warm his coat-tails while the chamber arranged itself around him. The cat and the dog knew the hearthrug too, and the children were allowed onto it as a treat, and so the rug in front of the grate became the small kingdom of the glow that the household, in its order of precedence, competed gently to occupy. Stand back and see it whole. The fierce contained coal fire in its iron grate, the marble rising above it with the clock and the mirror, the brass fender catching the glow at the foot, the iron standing ready, the rug spread before it like a threshold. This was not merely a heat source. It was the designed and decorated heart of the space, the business the furniture turned toward, the place the family drawn together, the altar, almost, of the domestic religion of the age, which held that the centre of a good life was a hearth with your people around it. Everything we are going to watch happen in this home today happens in orbit around fireplaces exactly like this one, and now that you have looked at one closely, you will recognize it in each chamber we enter. It shaped the very room, this fireplace, in ways we hardly notice. The chimney breast, the great projecting stack of brickwork that carried the flue up through the household, stood out from the wall and made of the hearth a natural recess and centre, and the chamber was planned around it, the best seat set to either side of the hearth in the snug angle of the breast, the chimney corner that was the most coveted ground in the building. In older and humbler buildings, this had been the ingle nook, the wide recess set right inside the chimney itself, where people could sit almost within the fireplace, in the very throat of the glow. And though the grand register grate of this townhouse had drawn the coals forward and shut the old chimney corner away, the instinct survived, the sense that the place beside the hearth, in the lee of the chimney breast, was the heart and the prize of the space. By now there is movement overhead. The grates have been lit long enough that 2 or 3 chambers have lost their killing edge, and the family is beginning to wake into a house that someone has been quietly preparing for them for 2 hours. Watching how they rise tells you almost everything about how warmth was rationed in such a place, because the morning of a Victorian family was a careful negotiation between a warmed bed, an unheated room, and the few heated points the maid had so far managed to create. Begin with the master and mistress in the principal bedroom. They have slept warm, buried in that architecture of feather and blanket and eiderdown, but the chamber around the bed is still raw, the frost ferns only just beginning to weep at the edges of the window glass, where a little warmth from the newly lit dressing-room fire next door is reaching. The maid has by now been in, as silently as she can, to light the bedchamber or dressing-room grate, and she has brought up from the basement the morning's first great luxury, a tall can of hot water from the range boiler, covered with a cloth or a special padded cosy to hold the glow through its long journey up the stairs and set it down by the washstand. Oh, with the hot water, very often came the first small comfort of the family's day, the early cup of tea brought up to the sleeping room before they had properly risen. While the master and mistress still lay warm behind their bed curtains, unwilling to break the seal of ease and meet the raw air, the maid would slip in, having lit or mended the grate as silently as she could, and set down a tray with the early tea, the first hot thing of the morning, to be drunk in bed in that brief reluctant interval between waking and rising. It was a small matter and a great luxury, that cup of hot tea taken under the covers while the flames next door took hold, and the space slowly lost the worst of its night chill, a way of easing the frame by degrees out of the deep comfort of the bed and toward the ordeal of the bite of it, wash and the colder dressing. And it meant that the maid, who had already been up for hours in the freeze, was in and out of the family's bedrooms before they stirred, tending the grate, bringing the water and the tea, doing the raw early work that turned the bedchamber from a frozen box into a place a person could bear to rise in, so that by the time the family put a foot to the floor, the worst of the morning had already been met and managed by someone else. That can of hot water has come up 4 stories on her arm, and it is the difference between a wash that is merely bracing and one that is frankly an ordeal, and the family receives it without a thought, as the natural order of matters, which to them it was. Watch the master rise. He does not leap from the heated bed into the chilly room and dress at leisure. Nobody did that in January who did not have to. He waits, if he can, until the dressing-room fire has caught and begun to throw some heat, and then he crosses quickly to it and dresses in front of it, in the one heated patch of the chamber, turning himself to the flames as he goes. The washing is done at the stand with the carried-up hot water poured into the basin, fast, because the air on wet skin in that room is bitter, and then comes the dressing, which in this period is itself a serious defence, layer upon deliberate layer. And we are going to look at it closely in a moment, because clothing was as much a part of staying warm as any fire. For now simply see the shape of the morning. The heated bed left at the last possible instant, the dash to the hearth, the quick wash in water someone taken up, the dressing done as near to the grate as a person can stand. Uttered. In the grander households, this near-the-fire dressing was a served affair, the gentleman with his valet to lay out the linen, warmed through, and help him into his coat, the lady with her maid to manage the laces and buttons and the many layers she could not reach herself, and the garments themselves were a real part of the service, set to take the chill off at the hearth, or before the kitchen range and brought up warm to be put on, so that nothing went onto the frame cold. In this comfortable but not enormous house the maid did duty where she was needed, warming the clothes and bringing the water and tending the hearth, and the family dressed in the warmed patch before the grate, layer over warmed layer, putting on first the matters, next the skin, and building up to the outer garments, turning to the grate as they went, until they were clothed and armoured against the frost, and could at last leave the snug island of the hearth and face the frozen room and the colder stairs. The mistress of the building rises into the same bitter, with the added labour that her dress is far more complicated than her husband's and takes longer to assemble, and so she too works near the embers, or has it built up well, and may have a maid to help her into the parts she cannot reach. The children in the nursery higher up are got out of their beds by the nurse into a space where the nursery hearth has been lit and guarded, and they are washed and dressed there in the heat, close to the grate, because nobody trusted a small child to the frost the way an adult could be trusted to endure it. Across the entire house, the same principle is at work. You do not heat the space and then live in it. You heat one spot, the hearth, and you arrange your body and your tasks as close to that spot as you can manage, and the raw cold of the rest of the chamber is simply tolerated as the price of the heated patch in the middle. And this is the one thing that is hardest for us to feel from the far side of central heating, so let us be plain about it. These people were not snug in the way we are snug. We warm the air of an entire house to an even temperature and move through it without thinking. Warmth, for us, is everywhere and invisible. For them, warmth was local and visible and always slightly scarce. It had a place, and the place was the grate, and you were snug in proportion to how near the coals you stood and how much clothing you had layered between yourself and everything else. A Victorian in the dead season was almost always a little cold somewhere, the side turned away from the grate, the toes on the icy floor, the hand that held the book away from the glow, and they lived with that the way we live with weather, as a simple condition of existence to be managed rather than abolished. The genius of the household was not that it kept the cold out, it was that it produced, fire by fire and can by can, enough islands of snugness that a family could live a comfortable life moving between them, leaving the frost to hold everything in between. So the family comes down at last, dressed and washed and ready, to a dining room where the hearth the maid lit before 6 is now a steady glowing bank of the glow, the space warm at last in its near half, and breakfast keeping hot on the hob, and they sit down to eat in the snugness that 3 hours of someone else's labour has built for them. We are going to sit down with them. But first, since dressing for the cold was half the battle of a Victorian winter, let us look at what they have actually put on. There is a reason the family can come down into a half-warmed room and sit through a winter's morning in tolerable comfort, and it has surprisingly little to do with the flames. It is what they are wearing. We are inclined to picture Victorian dress as an affair of fashion and propriety, the corset, the high collar, the layered skirts, and so it was. But beneath all the fashion, in winter, it was also a serious and many-layered engine for trapping the glow of the frame. A person dressed for a frozen house in this period carried far more clothing upon them, and far heavier clothing, than we would now think bearable. They could not heat the air around them, and so they wore their comfort instead, close against the skin, and they layered it the way we would put another log on a hearth fire. It begins, for very nearly everyone, with flannel. Flannel is woven wool, soft and slightly napped, and the age had something close to a religious faith in it, as the first defence against winter and against the chills that winter was thought to bring. Next to the skin went a flannel undergarment, a flannel petticoat for a woman, a flannel vest or undershirt for a man, and the smallest babies were wrapped in long flannel binders wound round and round the frame. Doctors prescribed flannel the way they prescribed sea air. To be caught in winter without your flannel next, the skin was considered not merely uncomfortable, but a positive invitation to illness. So the glow of the Victorian body started with this one soft woolen layer worn against the flesh, beneath everything else, by master and maid alike. Build the layers up from there on the mistress of the household, because her dress is the more elaborate. Over the flannel goes the chemise, and over that the stays the corset, which, though we think of it as an instrument of shape, was also a stiff warm wall of fabric across the trunk, then a flannel petticoat for warmth, then one or more further petticoats for fullness, and then the winter dress itself, which in the bite of it months was made of heavier stuff than the summer cottons, of merino and other fine wools, of thick weaves lined through the bodice, the assembly weighing several pounds and enclosing her from throat to wrist to floor. On top of that, indoors, she very likely wears a shawl, and the shawl is worth pausing on, because it is the period's great portable heater. A good wool or cashmere shawl, the famous paisley patterns among them, crossed over the chest and shoulders, was the business a woman reached for the moment she sat still, when the ease of movement left her and the chill of the chamber began to find her, and it could be thrown off near the hearth and drawn close again by the draughty window, a blaze she could carry from chair to chair. The men are scarcely less wrapped, though their layers are plainer. Over the woolen vest goes the shirt, and over the shirt the waistcoat, and we should not pass the waistcoat by as mere decoration, because in this period it was a genuine garment of snugness, often of wool, sometimes quilted or backed with flannel, buttoned high across the chest to cover the frame's core. Over that came the coat, the morning coat or the frock coat, heavy and close. A man sitting indoors in winter was covered in 3 or 4 layers of wool across his torso, and if the space was truly frozen, or if he were elderly, or simply sitting still for a while, he might add to it a knitted comforter at the throat, or fingerless mittens that left the fingers free to turn a page or hold a pen while keeping the hands themselves from going numb. The very picture of an old gentleman in a cold study, mittened, muffled, a rug across the knees, was not eccentricity. It was sensible engineering, and there was a whole wardrobe of comfort kept for sitting still and for going to bed, the parts of the day when the frame made least glow of its own. Indoors of an evening, a man might exchange his coat for a wadded dressing gown, or a quilted smoking jacket, padded with wool batting between the layers, made specifically to hold heat through a lengthy sedentary evening. At night both sexes wore nightcaps, and this too was not comedy but necessity, for a great deal of the frame's warmth escapes through the head, and a head left bare on a pillow in a bedroom rimed with frost would stay frozen all night. There were bed socks of knitted wool, and bed jackets to put round the shoulders for sitting up against the frost, and over the sleeper the architecture of blanket and eiderdown we have already seen. To go out of doors added the outermost shell, the greatcoat or the heavy mantle, the muffler wound twice round the neck, the gloves, and for a lady the muff, that cylinder of fur she slid both hands inside, a small warm refuge carried through the frozen streets. For all this wrapping, the cold still got at the frame where it could, and it left its mark in the small nagging affliction that haunted the Victorian winter, from top to bottom of the building the chilblain. Chilblains were the itching, burning, reddish purple swellings that came up on the fingers and the toes, on the heels and the ears and the tip of the nose, on any part left raw and then warmed too fast, and almost everyone got them. They were the price of cold extremities, and they were made worse, cruelly, by the very thing that promised relief. To come in with hands or feet, numb with raw and thrust them straight at the hearth, was the surest way to bring the chilblains up raw and maddening. Every nursery and each servant's hall knew the warning not to toast frozen feet at the grate, to warm slowly, to chafe the chilled limbs back to life by degrees rather than scorching them, and each household had its remedies. The rubbing with this or that ointment, or with a cut onion, or a dab of spirits, none of them very effective against an affliction whose only real cure was a warmth the houses could not provide. Through the winter months, the children's fingers and the maid's chapped hands and the old man's ears bore the itching, swollen evidence of the frost, a small constant discomfort so ordinary that it scarcely seemed worth remarking, the body's daily reminder that it was never quite snug enough. And to go out into that cold at all required an outer armour of its own, put on like a campaign. Over all the indoor layers went the heavy outdoor coat, the thick ulster, or the caped greatcoat for a man, the cloak, or the fur-trimmed mantle and the tippet of fur about the throat for a woman, the comforter wound round, the gloves drawn on, the bonnet tied down firmly against the wind, and sometimes a veil lowered over the face to take the bite of the icy air. On the soles went the stout winter boots, and over them, against the freezing wet and the slush and the filth of the winter roads, the galoshes or the old wooden pattens that lifted the sole clear of the frost ground. So armoured, muffled, gloved, but booted and veiled, a person could face the frozen street, and the difference between the indoor ease and the moment of stepping out into the raw cold was so sharp that the dressing for it was a deliberate and considered business, the building of a portable shelter of wool and fur, to be worn out into the weather and shed again, gratefully, on coming home to the hearth. So look again at the family settling to their breakfast. They are not lightly dressed people in a snug room. They are heavily, deliberately, scientifically wrapped people in a chamber that is snug only in patches, and the clothing is doing quite as much of the work as the grate. This is the second great principle of keeping snug in such a house, standing beside the first. You make islands of comfort at the hearths, and you carry your own warmth about with you, woven and wadded and layered onto your body, so that even out at the raw edge of the chamber, even on the stairs, even in the frost-ferned bedroom, you are never entirely without it. The hearth was only half the answer. The other half, they wore, "Come and sit at the breakfast table now, because the morning meal in winter shows you, better than almost anything, the strange divided climate the family actually lived inside, where comfort and discomfort existed a yard apart in the same space. The dining room fire that the maid lit before 6 is now a deep, steady bank of glowing coal, throwing a strong heat out across the hearthrug and the nearer half of the space, and the table has been set within that reach, so that the family eat in genuine warmth, their faces lit and heated by the grate, the silver and the china catching its glow. But step 3 feet back from the table toward the window, and you walk out of summer into winter without leaving the chamber. The warmth of a coal hearth is fierce, but it is also directional and short-ranged. It warms what faces it and what stands near it, and it does very little for the far corners. So the dining room at breakfast is a place of two climates. By the coals, the family is snug to the point of comfort. Over by the tall sash windows, where the frost pours steadily off the glass and pools along the floor, the air is raw enough to mist the breath, and the drapes stir very slightly with the cold current, even when they are drawn. The room has a heated pole and a cold pole, and everyone in it has arranged themselves without thinking at the warm one. This is why the furniture and the small apparatus of the space is the way it is. The chairs are drawn close. Between the company and the door, or between the company and the worst of the window, very often stands a screen, a folding panel of wood or covered framework, sometimes a beautiful thing of embroidered or papered panels, whose entire purpose is to cut off the moving air and throw the flames' heat back toward the people. A pole screen, a single decorated panel on a stand, might be set between a particular person and the grate, not to keep heat off so much as to shield a face from the fierce direct scorch of the coals, while the body stayed warm, for a coal fire close to could redden, and even mark the skin of a lady who sat too long, full in its glare. Warmth in this space was strong enough to need managing, blocking here, channeling there, and the screen was the tool for managing it. And because the cold pooled lowest of all about the toes, where it clustered along the floor and struck up through the boards, the soles had their own particular defences. People kept their feet up off the icy floor wherever they could, on a footstool or a hassock or a low fender stool, for the inch or two of air between a slipper and the floorboards made a real difference over a sitting. And for the worst of it, there was the foot warmer, a portable box of warmth set beneath the soles. In its simplest form, a hot brick or a metal canister of hot water in a wooden frame. In its older form, a pierced box holding a pan of glowing embers, slid under the table or into the pew of a freezing church, where whole congregations sat through long services with their chilled feet on little stoves of hot coals or hot water against the deadly chill of the stone. The same idea went travelling. A winter journey by carriage was a bitter business, and travellers wrapped themselves in rugs and slid a foot warmer onto the floor, a flat metal container of hot water or, later, of a chemical that gave out heat, to keep the toes from going dead with cold over the freezing miles. And the railways, those great agents of the age, came in time to provide the same. The lengthy flat foot warmers passed into the carriages and refilled with hot water at the busier stations, so that a traveller might keep some feeling in the feet through a winter journey across the frozen country. The food itself was part of the glow, and the arrangements for keeping it hot tell you how short a journey heat could survive. The breakfast has come up from the basement kitchen, up the back stairs, the entire length of the household, and in that journey a hot dish loses a great deal. So the serious business of breakfast happens at the grate. Dishes are kept hot on the hob, the flat iron ledges at the sides of the grate built for exactly this, or on a trivet swung over the coals, or under metal covers, there might be a hot water dish, a serving dish, with a reservoir of hot water beneath the food to hold its warmth, and the toast, of which more later, was very often made at the table's own fire rather than hauled up cold from below. The tea came up the moment it was wanted, and was kept under a cosy. Every part of the meal was in a small race against the bite of the chamber, and the grate was the line it had to stay close to. And consider, while the family eats in their heated half of the space, who is not eating, the maid who built this fire and the rest, the cook below who sent the breakfast up, the kitchen maid hauling the next scuttle of coal, have long since had whatever they will get and are at work. The family's leisured warm breakfast sits on top of hours of other people's raw early labour, as everything in this home does. But within the snug circle of the table, the morning has the deep ordinary comfort that the machine exists to produce, the hearth steady, the food hot, the family assembled, the frost on the window slowly weeping into water as the chamber at last gets the better of the night. The breakfast itself was a cosy and solid one, fit for facing a freezing day. There was porridge or a hot milky gruel to begin, warming from the first spoonful. There were the cooked dishes kept hot on the hob or under their covers, the bacon and eggs, the kidneys, the fish, the chops, whatever the dwelling ran to, all of them wanting to be eaten hot and losing the race to the frost of the space if they were not. There was toast made at the hearth, and hot rolls, and tea or coffee, fresh and scalding from the pot, under its cosy. A cold breakfast on a frozen morning was a miserable thing, and a well-run house did not serve one. The point of the early lit fire and the hot dishes and the covered pot was to send the family out into the wintry day warmed from the inside, fed and fortified, with a good hot meal banked in them against the hours of chill ahead. There were small refinements of warmth at the table that the comfortable household prided itself on. The plates were warmed before the hearth or on the rack of the range, so that the hot food should not strike cold the moment it was served onto chilled china. The rolls were warmed, and in the most particular houses, even the master's newspaper might be passed before the grate to take the damp chill of the foggy morning out of its pages before it reached his hands. These were small matters, the heated plate and the aired paper, but they are the very signature of a house with warmth to spare and servants to lavish it, the kind of comfort that consisted not in any one great heat, but in 100 small cold things being quietly heated before they were wanted, so that the family met no raw edge anywhere through the morning that someone below had not already taken the chill from. It is the first of the day's good hours, and it has been a time coming. Notice, before we move on, how much of what we have seen already is about boundaries and edges. The heated patch and the cold patch in one chamber. The fire's heat that fails a yard away. The screen drawn against the through draught. The hot dish racing the journey up the stairs. Keeping snug in this dwelling was never a business of filling the entire place with an even heat. It was an affair of drawing lines, of holding small territories of comfort against a frost that pressed in at each door and window and corner, and was never far off. And there was one enemy, more than any other, that those lines were drawn against. It came in under the doors and around the windows, invisible and patient, and the household waged a quiet daily war upon it. It was the cold current. If you had asked anyone in this home what most threatened their comfort in winter, they would not have said the chill in the abstract. They would have said the moving air, that thin moving thread of frozen air that found its way in through each crack and gap and ran along the floor and around the ankles and across the back of the neck, stealing the grate's warmth away and carrying the frost of the road right into the heart of the warm chamber. A still chill can be borne. You dress against it and sit by the hearth and you manage. A draught is moving air with the bite in it, and the Victorian household fought it with a whole armoury of devices and habits that we have very nearly forgotten because our sealed modern houses no longer need them. The great sources of the trouble were the windows and the doors. The tall sash windows that gave these spaces their light were made of two wooden frames that slid past one another, and wood swells and shrinks with the weather, so that even a good sash seldom sealed perfectly. There was usually a gap where the two frames met in the middle, and gaps at the sides where they ran in their grooves, and through each one of these the wind outside pressed a steady cold stream. The doors were worse, hung with a finger's width of space beneath them for clearance, and that gap at the floor was a direct open channel under which the raw air of the unheated hall and stairs slid into the heated room and pooled, because raw air sinks and travels low, so that a space could be pleasant at head height and bitter around the feet. So the household stopped the gaps with whatever ingenuity it had. Round the edges of a door that let in the freeze, a strip of felt or woolen list might be nailed, a soft draught strip pressed against as it closed, sealing the line where the bite of it came whistling through. The crack of a window that would not be opened again until spring might be pasted over with strips of paper, glued down for the duration of the winter to dam the through draught, the window deliberately sealed shut for the season, and the place committed to such air as the chimney and the door would give it. A keyhole that breathed cold could be covered with its little swinging plate. The stuffed sausage or snake was laid at the foot of each door that wanted it, and these were often the work of the household's own hands, made up from scraps and offcuts, sometimes by the children, a lengthy fabric tube filled with sand or sawdust, and set down each evening against the gap, a small homely barricade against the moving air. None of it was elegant and all of it was necessary, and a well-kept winter room was one whose each crack and seam had been sought out and stopped, listed and papered and sandbagged and curtained, so that the precious glow of the hearth was not forever leaking away into the freezing dark through 100 small unattended gaps. Against the windows the first line of defence was the shutters. Most good chambers of the period had internal wooden shutters folded back into the window revealed during the day, and at dusk these were closed and barred across the glass, a solid wooden wall drawn over the coldest surface in the chamber, cutting off both the cold current and the great outward bleed of heat through the panes. Over the shutters, or where there were none, came the hangings, and winter curtains were heavy for a reason, thick wool or velvet or rep, hung in deep folds from above the window to the floor, long enough to lie on the ground and seal the bottom, drawn close the moment the lamplight failed. Shutters and curtains together turned a window from a sheet of leaking cold into a muffled, blocked, insulated wall, and the difference in a room when they were closed of an evening was immediate and felt. Against the doors the household deployed humbler but cleverer matters. Along the foot of a door, to block that low-travelling stream, was laid the draught excluder, a long stuffed tube of fabric, sometimes filled with sand, sometimes with sawdust or scraps, that the age sometimes called a sausage or a snake, and that a careful housewife or a child might make and decorate, set down against the gap to dam the cold flow. Over a doorway that opened to a freezing passage might hang a portière, a heavy curtain on a rod fixed to the door itself, so that it brought its own insulation with it as it swung. Sandbags were laid along sills, and the screens we have already met did duty here too, stood across a doorway, or in the path between a freezing source and a warm seat to break the moving air. The whole room, looked at this way, was a fortress under quiet siege, with its walls of shutter and curtain, its barricades of stuffed fabric at the thresholds, its inner keep of screens around the hearth. There were habits too, as much as objects. People closed doors behind them, always, instinctively, in a way that has largely left us. An open one in winter was a small domestic crime, letting the glow of one hard-heated room flood away into the chill of the building. Spaces not in use were shut up and left cold, their grates unlit, their doors closed, so that the household's whole heat could be concentrated into the few spaces actually occupied. The family did not heat the household. They warmed a moving handful of rooms within it, and sealed those spaces as tightly as shutter and curtain and sausage and screen could manage, and let the rest of the building stay as cold as the weather. To keep warm was, in large part, to wage this endless small war against the moving air, to stop each gap, close each door, draw each curtain, and so to hold the precious manufactured heat inside the walls long enough to be enjoyed before it found its inevitable way out into the night. And yet, against all this sealing and stopping and stuffing, there ran a powerful contrary anxiety, for the age was nearly as frightened of bad air as it was of the freeze. The sanitary reformers and the doctors preached, with real conviction, that stale, unventilated air was a breeder of disease, that a room sealed too tight and breathed in too long grew poisonous, that fresh air, even cold fresh air, was a necessity of health, and its absence a slow danger. So the household was caught between two fears, the fear of the frost draught and the fear of the close stale air, and it never quite resolved them. It is why the sleeping room window stood cracked an inch on the bitterest night, why the fresh air doctrine sent the children out into the frost, why a careful mistress worried over the heavy curtained, tight-shut evening room even as she sealed it. The same people who waged daily war on each draught also believed, uneasily, that a little of the icy air they fought must be let in, for the good of the lungs, so that the management of comfort was always also a negotiation with the dread of stagnant air. Now go to the window of the warm chamber, draw back an edge of the heavy curtain, and look out, because the winter world beyond the glass had a character all its own in a city like this, and it was made of the very same business that kept the family warm. By the middle of the morning, on a still bitter day, the air of the town outside has thickened and yellowed and begun to close down the view, and by afternoon it may have become the one thing the period knew so well and dreaded and almost grew fond of, the dense brown winter fog that Londoners called a pea-souper, or, with grim affection, a London particular. We should be clear about what this fog actually was, because it is the gloom twin of everything cosy we have been describing. It was smoke. It was the smoke of all those hundreds of thousands of coal hearths, The maids' grates and the kitchen ranges, and the factory furnaces, each one of them pouring its plume up its chimney into the winter sky, exactly as we watched the smoke begin to rise from the terrace at dawn. On a windy day it blew away. But on a still, cold, damp winter's day, when the air did not move and a natural river fog had formed, the coal smoke had nowhere to go. It mixed with the wet air and hung and thickened, and the more the city burned to keep itself heat, the denser it grew until the town was wrapped in a cold, sulphurous, brown-yellow murk that stung the eyes and caught at the throat and turned noon into a kind of dusk. The warmth indoors and the foulness outdoors were the same coal seen from two sides of the window. To be out in it was a strange and muffled ordeal. The fog swallowed sound and distance. The far side of the street vanished, then the near side, until a person moved through a small travelling bubble of dim visibility with the grey-brown nothing pressing in on every side. The gas lamps, lit early on such days because the daylight had failed, hung in the murk as soft, useless halos, marking where they were without lighting anything around them. People found their own front doors by counting railings. Traffic crawled, link boys and crossing sweepers and the drivers of cabs feeling their way, and over it all lay the smell, the unmistakable reek of a coal fog, sharp and sooty and faintly sulphurous, that worked its way indoors around the very shutters and hangings drawn against it, so that even in the snug sealed room you caught the faint tang of the city burning. The fog left its mark on everything it touched, smutting the washing on the line, blackening the stonework of the buildings year by year, settling a fine grime on every outdoor surface, the soft outer evidence of the same grates that warmed every hearth. Out in that raw and smoke-thickened street there was warmth to be had too, of a humbler and more public kind, and it drawn together round the little fires of the street sellers. On the corner the chestnut seller stood over his glowing brazier, a pan of hot coals on legs, roasting chestnuts that sent up their sweet smoke into the frozen air, and his blaze was a small beacon of heat that cold passers-by drew near to under the pretence of buying. The baked potato man went his rounds with his can, a coal-fired oven on wheels, the hot potatoes inside it serving a double purpose, for a cold customer would buy one as much to carry in a frozen pocket and heat the hands upon as to eat, a potato or a paper of roast chestnuts being the cheapest hand-warmer the winter pavements afforded. These little fires of the cellars, the brazier and the potato can and the muffin man's covered tray, were the only warmth that the people who worked the winter streets could count on, the crossing sweeper stamping at his corner, the cabman frozen on his box, the errand boy with his hands jammed under his arms, all of them out in the frost that the family indoors had shut so carefully away, and all of them drawn, when they could be, to the small glow of a cellar's fire, the poor man's hearth on the open street. And nowhere was the cold met more stoically than in church on a winter Sunday. The great stone churches held the frost of the season in their walls and floors like a cellar, scarcely heated at all, or not at all, and the congregation came to them wrapped as if for a journey, in their greatcoats and furs and shawls, the women with muffs and foot-warmers, many a family bringing its own hot brick or foot-stove to set in the pew against the deadly chill that struck up from the stone floor through the thin soles of Sunday boots. The breath of the entire congregation rose visibly in the raw, biting air of the nave. The parson preached in his coat. The cold crept into the feet and the fingers through the service, until the final blessing was a release, as much from the chill as from the sermon. To sit still for an hour or two in an unheated stone church in the depth of winter was one of the colder ordinaries of the season, endured weekly, met with foot-warmer and muff and many layers, a reminder that beyond the carefully heated home the buildings of the world were mostly as cold inside as out, and that warmth was a business you carried with you or did without, and it carried a real cost, though the family at the window did not yet know the half of it. The mixture of freezing damp and coal smoke was hard on the lungs, and in the worst and longest fogs the old and the weak and the consumptive sickened, and some of them died, and the bills of mortality would rise in the foggy weeks. The period understood that the fog was unpleasant and unhealthy, without fully grasping how dangerous the densest of it could be. The truly catastrophic fogs, the ones that killed in their thousands, belonged to a later age than this one, and we should not borrow their horror and lay it over our quiet 1870s morning. But even here, even now, the family at the window looking out at the thickening brown afternoon understood that the price of a city kept snug by coal was a winter sky made filthy by it, and that the same fires that clustered them in comfort were, altogether, fouling the very air of the town. So let the curtain fall back, and turn again to the grate. This was the deep paradox the Victorians lived inside, and mostly chose not to dwell on. The hearth that was the heart of the building, the snugness that was the subject of this short day, the glowing, comfortable grate the family loved and assembled round, was also multiplied across 1,000,000 chimneys, the maker of the choking dark that hung over the street. They could not have one without the other. To keep warm was to make smoke, and to make smoke on the scale of a great city was to make fog, and the cosy room and the poisoned sky were two ends of a single chimney. The family pulled the curtain and trimmed the lamp against the early dark, and drew a little closer to the coals, and the smoke of those very coals went up to join the brown weight pressing down on the roofs above them. There is a part of the dwelling we have not yet thought about, and it runs unseen through the whole of it, behind the walls and up through the floors, and the keeping of snugness depended on it entirely, and so did a great hidden cruelty. These are the chimneys, the flues, the black vertical passages that carried the smoke of each fire up and out above the roof, and without which not one of the grates we have admired could burn at all. A fire needs its draught, the pull of air up the flue that feeds the flames and carries the smoke away. Choke the flue and the embers will not burn, and the place will fill with smoke instead of comfort. So the flues had to be kept clear, and the keeping of them clear is one of the darker threads running behind all this brightness. A coal blaze is a dirty servant. As it burns it sends not only smoke but tar and soot up the flue, and that soot clings and builds, layer upon greasy black layer, on the inner walls of the chimney, narrowing the passage, hardening into a crust, until the flue draws badly and the coal sulks and smokes back into the chamber, and until, at worst, the accumulated soot itself catches alight in a roaring, dangerous chimney fire that could set the house ablaze. So every chimney in regular use had to be swept clean several times a year, for a hearth fire burned daily, and the sweep and his brushes were as much a part of the winter household as the coalman, called in to drive his jointed rods and round brushes up the gloom flue from the hearth below, twisting and pushing, while the soot came showering down into the sheet spread across the fireplace, and the family kept well clear of the filthy business, and the swept room was cleaned and the flames relaid and lit, drawing sweetly once more. And there was a sharp reason the sweeping could not be neglected, beyond the mere sulking of a smoky fire, for a flue left too long uncleaned carried a real danger of catching alight. The soot that lined the chimney was itself fuel, greasy and combustible, and if it built up thick and a fierce fire below sent its flames and sparks high enough, the soot in the flue could ignite, and a chimney hearth was a frightening thing, a sudden roar in the wall like a furnace, flame and burning soot driving up the flue and out of the pot in a shower of sparks over the roof, the bricks growing hot enough to threaten the timbers of the home, and to set light to a neighbouring roof from the rain of sparks. The household fought it as best it could, raking out the hearth below, closing the space up to starve the flue of air, throwing wet sacking or salt on the grate to smother and cool it, while the chimney roared and the family prayed the bricks would hold. A bad chimney fire could burn a house down, and the regular sweeping of the flues was as much a guard against that terror as it was an affair of keeping the grate drawing well, one more of the unseen labours on which the safety of all this heat depended. But behind the respectable sweep with his rods and brushes lay a history that the 1870s were only just, and only barely, bringing to a close, and we should speak of it plainly and then let it rest, because it is the true cost hidden in all this comfort, and to leave it out would be to tell a comfortable lie. For the better part of a century, the way many chimneys had been cleaned was by sending a child up them. The flues of these houses were often narrow and bent at sharp angles, too tight for any grown man, and so small boys, some of them 4 and 5 and 6 years old, apprenticed or sold into the trade, were made to climb up inside the chimneys in the dark, bracing with their knees and elbows and bare feet against the soot-caked brick, to scrape and brush the flue clean from the inside. It was brutal, frightening, filthy, and dangerous work. The children were burned and scarred and choked with soot, and some of them stuck fast in the narrow dark and could not be got out in time, and died there. It is a hard thing, and it sat directly behind the warm, clean hearths of comfortable homes for generations. The conscience of the age had been turning against it for a long while, slowly and against fierce resistance. Law after law had been passed to forbid the use of climbing boys, and law after law had been quietly ignored, because the machines that could sweep a chimney mechanically existed, but cost money, and a child cost less. It was only after years of campaigning, and after the death of a particular boy stuck in a particular flue had shamed the nation, that a law was passed in the middle of this decade, in the year 1875, that at last put real force behind the ban, requiring sweeps to be licensed and giving the police the power to stop them, and so finally closing the chimneys to children for good. Our winter's day sits just on the near side of that change, in the last years when the old cruelty was being stamped out, and the sweep who comes to this respectable house comes now with rod and brush, and not with a frightened child, but the memory of how it had so long been done was fresh, and the warm, clean flues of the past had been bought at a price that does not bear much looking at. So when the coals draws sweetly tonight, and the smoke goes up the swept flue, and the place stays clear and warm, hold that knowledge somewhere quietly at the back of it. The hearth was the heart of the Victorian home, and it was also for a long time served by the smallest and most defenceless hands in the country, climbing in the dark above the very rooms where the families sat snug. The age was learning, late and slowly, to be ashamed of that, and to clear its chimneys another way. We can be glad we have arrived in the years when that shame was finally doing its work, and turn back now to the glow indoors, carrying the knowledge of what it had cost with us, gently, as we go. Let us follow, for a little while, the person on whom all this comfort most heavily rests, because we have watched her light the first fire in the dark, and then rather lost sight of her, and the truth is that she has not stopped, and will not stop, until long after the family has gone up to bed. The housemaid, and in a house with more than one the under-housemaid below her, spends the entire short winter's day in motion, and the great recurring labour of that day, behind all her other tasks, is the feeding and tending and carrying that the household's many fires require. We have admired the snugness. Now watch what the heat costs in a young woman's legs and back and hands. Think first of the simple arithmetic of it. There may be 6 or 8 or 10 fires burning in this dwelling on a freezing day, the dining room and the breakfast room, the parlour, the master's dressing room and the principal bedroom when wanted, the nursery, the morning room, the study, the great range below. Each of those hearths must be laid and lit, and each must then be fed, a little and often, all through the hours it burns, with coal brought up from the cellar under the street. The coal does not bring itself. Every scuttle that stands beside every grate has been filled in the basement and taken up 1 or 2 or 3 flights by hand, and when it is empty, it must be carried down and filled and hauled up again, and a single hearth burning steadily through a winter's day might eat its way through several scuttles, and there are 6 or 8 fires. The maid's day is built around the stairs, up with the full scuttle, down with the empty, up with the hot water can, down with the slops, up, down, from before dawn until the family retires, and the carrying is only the half of it. Each grate must be watched and tended, so that it neither dies nor blazes wastefully. The maid moves through her rooms, putting on coal with the tongs, raking the ash through the bars, sweeping the spilled cinders from the hearth, and at intervals a grate burned low through the day must be made up afresh. The hearths must be kept clean, for a Victorian hearth was a point of pride, and a dirty one a disgrace. So the fender is rubbed bright, and the spilled ash swept, and the coals irons set straight on, all day. Her hands are never clean and never warm for long. They are blacked with coal and ash, chapped by the chill of the cellar, and the slops and the freezing water, reddened and roughened by work, and at night they ache. This was the body that the ease ran on, and the fires were only the half of her cold labour. Before the family was down, she had the front step to do, out in the raw early air on her knees with a bucket of water already skinning with ice, scrubbing and whitening the stone in the raw dark, so that the building should present a clean face to the street. There was the cold scullery work, the washing up in water that had to be fetched and heated, and went cold fast, the scrubbing of floors with icy water, and a brush that left her fingers red and raw, the carrying down of the slops and the ashes, the cleaning of the grates that filled her lungs with grey ash. Her hands paid for all of it, cracked and chapped and chill-blaned, plunged from hot water to raw and out into the frost and back, never given time to mend. A housemaid's palms in winter were a roughened, reddened, painful record of the chill work she did, and she rubbed what salve she could into them at night, and rose to do it all again before light. The warmth the family lived in was brought up on those hands, and the frost the family was spared was met instead by her at the step and the sink and the cellar and the slop pail, all through the bitter early hours when the household above still slept warm. She is summoned, on top of all this, by the bells. Down in the basement passage hangs a row of bells, one for each principal room on coiled springs, and a pull on a handle upstairs sets the right one jangling below, and the maid must drop whatever she is doing and climb to answer it, because the flames in the drawing-room is low, or more coals are wanted in the study, or the master finds his dressing-room grate not made up to his liking. The warmth the family enjoys so unthinkingly is, from below stairs, a constant stream of summonses and climbings and carryings, an unending demand that the islands of heat be kept burning, and the cold held back, fire by fire, hour by hour, by a person whose own attic bedroom will never have a blaze in it at all. That last fact deserves to be sat with, because it is the sharp point of the entire arrangement. The maid who keeps every fire in the dwelling burning sleeps, herself, in the one chamber that is never heated. She manufactures the household's warmth all day, and climbs at night to a freezing attic under the roof to sleep in the chill she has spent the day banishing from everyone else's rooms. There is no malice in it. It is simply how the world was ordered, and she would have expected nothing else, and a good place in a kind house was a business to be valued. But it is worth our seeing clearly, on this warm imagined evening, that the snugness we are sinking into so gratefully was real, precisely because someone else was carrying it up the stairs to us all day long, and would be cold tonight so that we could be snug. The Victorian hearth glowed at the centre of the home, It was kept glowing by hands that paid for it. Let us turn back now to gentler matters, and go up to the one chamber in the home where the glow was guarded most carefully of all, and watched over with the most anxious love, because it held the most precious and the most fragile of the household's people. Let us go up to the nursery. The nursery sits high in the building, up where the stairs grow narrower, and it is a world of its own with its own rules, and the first rule of it in winter is that the flames must never go out and must never ever be left unguarded. Here live the youngest children of the family, with their nurse, and here the management of heat takes on a particular tenderness and a particular anxiety, because a small child cannot be trusted to mind the chill, and cannot be trusted near the hearth, and so the nursery grate is tended with more care than any other in the household. The room itself is kept snug through the day in a way the grander rooms below are not, for the children are here all the time and cannot dress against the frost as the adults do, and a chilled infant was a frightening thing in an age when so many infants did not survive their first winters. So the nursery hearth is lit early and kept up steadily, and the chamber holds a close, even, slightly stuffy warmth, quite different from the fierce and cold division of the dining room, a warmth meant to wrap the children like a blanket. The window is checked for draughts, the door kept shut, and the high space husbanded as a reservoir of gentle heat, in a way that speaks of how precious and how precarious small lives were felt to be. In front of the hearth stands the one indispensable object, the nursery fireguard. This is a tall framework of brass or iron mesh, or of close-set bars, that stands across the entire front of the grate, fixed so that it cannot be pulled over, fencing the burning coals off completely from small reaching hands and from skirts and pinafores that might brush too near. An open grate and a crawling child are a deadly combination, and the household knew it. Burns and worse were among the commonest disasters of childhood, and the high mesh guard was the wall that stood between the nursery's heat and its danger. The nurse watched it as she watched the children, and the guard was never moved while they were about, so that the grate could be enjoyed for its glow and its dancing light without ever being touched. That same guard did double duty, for the fender and the front of the guard were where the nursery's washing was aired and warmed. Damp clothes and napkins and small garments were hung on the bars and rails to dry in the blaze's heat, and the children's clothes for the morning were set there overnight to take the chill off, so that nothing went onto a little body, cold and damp, and a child's nightgown warmed at the nursery hearth, and then run up the frozen corridor and over the head in the chill bedroom, was one of the little mercies of the day. There was almost always something warming at the nursery grate, a garment airing, a flannel heating, and at the right hours milk. A cup of milk set in a little pan on the hob or by the bars, warmed gently for a child coming in cold from the brief frozen turn in the garden that the doctors insisted upon even in winter, that the child wrapped and brought in pink-cheeked and stamping, to be sat by the guard with heated milk and have its chilled hands chafed back to life. For out the children went, even in the depth of winter, because the doctors of the age were firm that fresh air, and plenty of it, was the making of a healthy child, and a daily walk or an hour in the freeze garden was prescribed in all but the very worst weather. So the children were bundled into their layers, the woolen gaiters and the warm coats and the comforters wound round, the hands pushed into knitted gloves or a small muff, and sent out with the nurse into the frost to take the air, to stamp and run and grow raw and bright-cheeked, and then brought in again, half-frozen and glowing, to be thawed at the nursery hearth. The thawing was its own small ritual, and had to be done with care, the frozen hands chafed and not scorched, the chilled feet warmed by degrees, and not thrust straight at the coals lest the chilblains rise, the cold child set near the guard with heated milk, and gradually brought back to comfort. There was a particular pleasure that any child who has come in frozen from the freeze still knows, in that slow thawing by the grate, the tingling return of feeling to the fingers, the glow soaking back into a body chilled through, the milk and the glow and the safety of the snug room after the bright, hard cold outside. And it was one of the small, deep comforts the nursery fire was kept burning to provide. So the nursery was, in its way, the emotional centre of the apparatus we have been describing, the place where keeping warm stopped being a business of comfort and became an affair of love and of fear. Every other fire in the dwelling warmed people who could fend for themselves. This one heated those who could not, and it was tended accordingly, never out, never unguarded, the milk on the hob and the clothes on the rail and the nurse forever between the children and the coals. If you want to know what the hearth meant to the Victorians, beyond all its brass and marble, look at the nursery, where the blaze was the business that kept the smallest people of the family alive through the frost, and was watched over hour by hour as if it were, as in a sense it was, the warm beating heart on which their lives depended. Warmth, in this house, did not only come from outside the body, from fires and flannel and the wrapped bed. A great deal of it came from within, from hot food and hot drink taken steadily through the wintry day, and the winter kitchen below was busy, from morning to night turning the glow of the range into the kind of warming, solid, fortifying meals that a body needs to make its own heat against the chill. To eat well and hot, and often was a part of keeping warm quite as deliberate as banking up the grate, and the Victorian winter table was built around it. The food of a cold season was heavy, and meant to be. This was the time of year for the great warming dishes, for soups and broths simmered all morning at the side of the range until they were rich and thick, for roast joints turning their fat and filling the kitchen with heat and savour, for stews and hashes, and made dishes that used the slow, steady warmth of the closed ovens, and above all, for the puddings, the boiled suet puddings that are so bound up with the English winter, hot heavy puddings of flour and suet and dried fruit, steamed for hours in a cloth in a pot at the range, dense and sweet and warming, that sat in the stomach like a banked fire of their own. A working body in a frozen house burned a great deal of fuel, and the table fed it the rich, fatty, sustaining food that let it keep its furnace going. The principal meal came in the middle of the day in many households, or in the earlier evening in more fashionable ones, and whenever it came it was the warm anchor of the day, the hot dinner sent up from the basement in its race against the frost of the stairs, the covers lifted to let the steam rise into the heated room, and around the meal ran a steady current of hot drink that never quite stopped. Tea, of course, the great warming ritual of the age, made fresh and strong and often, the kettle forever, moving toward the boil on the range or on the hob of the parlour hearth. Cocoa and hot milk for the children and the nursery, and for the adults on a bitter night, the warming drinks that were thought to put heat into the blood, a glass of hot negus or mulled and spiced wine, a hot toddy of spirits and sugar, and hot water, taken last thing against the chill of the bedchamber, a posset for an invalid, all of them ways of carrying the coals' heat down inside the body where the flannel and the grate could not reach. Some of the glow of the winter table was made, still, at a coal fire rather than in the closed range, for the old way of roasting had not wholly died. A proper roast, many cooks held, could only be had before a clear open fire, the meat hung in front of the blaze and turning slowly so that every side met the glow, the fat spitting and the dripping caught in a pan below to baste it, and later to make the dripping that was itself a winter food spread thick on bread. To turn the meat there was the jack, a clockwork engine wound up like a great watch, the bottle jack hanging before the hearth and revolving the joint steadily on its hook, ticking away through the afternoon while the roast browned and the kitchen filled with the smell of it and the radiant glow of the open roasting fire beat out into the space. And at the gentler end of the ranger's work were the foods of the sick room and the cradle, the warm, soft, nourishing matters made for the ill, the old, the very young, and the newly delivered mother, the thin, warm gruel, the caudle of warm, spiced and thickened wine or ale, the posset of hot milk curdled with wine, the beef tea, all of them carried hot and comforting to the bedside. The kitchen's warmth turned to healing, the flames reaching even into the chill sick room in the form of something hot to be spooned slowly down, and the timing of the meals themselves was bound up with the glow of the day. In many households the heavy meal still came at midday, or in the early afternoon, the hot dinner taken at the warmest, lightest part of the short winter's day, so that the body had its great hot fueling when the cold was least, and faced the cold evening and night on the strength of it. In the more fashionable houses dinner had moved later, into the evening, and the gap was bridged by the institution of luncheon and by the tea that we have seen. Either way the principle held, that the body was kept stoked through the bitter day by a steady succession of hot meals and hot drinks, never long without something hot inside it. The inner fire fed as carefully and as regularly as the fires in the grates, because the Victorians understood, without needing the science of it, that a well-fed body made its own comfort, and a hungry one could not, and that to keep snug in winter you had to keep eating, and eating hot. The very flavours of winter food leaned toward warmth, for the age believed, as older ages had, that certain foods and spices heated the blood and others cooled it, and the winter table reached for the heating ones. Ginger and pepper, mustard and horseradish, cinnamon and nutmeg and clove, the warming spices, went into the season's dishes and drinks, the mulled wine and the spiced ale, the gingerbread and the hot pepperiness of a winter sauce, all of them thought to put a glow into the blood and to fortify it against the chill. Whether the heating of the blood was real or imagined hardly mattered. The spiced and peppery and gingered foods of winter felt warming, and were eaten for that comfort, the snugness of the spice on the tongue standing in for the glow of the blaze. One more way the season turned everything it could toward the keeping out of the chill. There is a real physiology beneath all this, dimly understood at the time and clearer to us now, that the cold makes the body spend its warmth fast, and that food and drink, especially hot, rich, fatty food, give it the fuel to make more. The Victorians knew from plain experience that a person who had eaten a good hot dinner could face the cold far better than one who had not, that the children were less fretful, and the servants worked better, and the entire household was more cheerful and more proof against the winter, when it was well and warmly fed. So the heating of the family from within was taken as seriously as the heating of the chambers, and the range that we met at dawn, roaring and ticking in the basement, spent its whole day not only heating the water and the kitchen, but turning out, dish after dish, the hot solid fuel that the family burned to keep their own small interior fires alight. Stand once more, before we go up, in the glow of the late morning kitchen, where the range is at its fiercest and the dinner is coming on. There is broth at the side and a joint in the oven and a pudding boiling in its cloth and a kettle on the boil, and the cook moves through the comfort of it, red-faced and damp, and the smell of all of it, the meat and the suet and the tea, is the very smell of winter comfort. All of that warmth is about to climb the stairs in covered dishes to the heated half of the dining room, where the family will take it in, and be fed, and be fortified, and carry the glow of it in their bodies out into the freezing dark afternoon. The fire warmed the place. The food warmed the people. The house needed both, and the kitchen made them both out of the same banked coals. The afternoon of a winter day is short, and it fails early, the brown light going out of the fogged sky by the middle of the afternoon, and as the dark comes on the household draws in toward the hearth, for the gentlest and most companionable of its warm rituals, the taking of tea. By now the great labours of the day are mostly done, the dinner digested, the glow too poor for much work, and the family gathers in the heated room as the afternoon dies, and the grate, which has been the servant of the day, becomes for an hour or two the centre of a small and cosy ceremony. Tea itself was the warm heart of it, the kettle brought to the boil on the hob of the parlour grate, or carried up hot from the range, the pot warmed and filled, the steam rising, the apparatus of cups and saucers, and the tea matters set out near the blaze. But the part of the tea that belongs most to the hearth, the part that could only happen at the grate, was the toast. Toast was made in this house, at the grate itself, and the making of it was half the pleasure. Someone, very often one of the children as a treat, took up the toasting fork, that long-handled fork of wire or iron made for exactly this, speared a thick slice of bread upon it, and held it out to the red glowing wall of the coals, turning it, watching it, drawing it back when it browned, until the slice was crisped and golden on both faces, and faintly smoky from the coals, and then it was buttered at once while hot, so the butter sank in, and eaten there by the grate. And it was not only plain toast. This was the season of the hot buttered matters that the English winter tea is built upon, of muffins and crumpets and pikelets and hot tea cakes, all of them warmed or toasted at the hearth and drowned in butter and eaten by the glow. The muffin man came through the freezing streets in the late afternoon with his tray balanced on his head and his bell ringing, and his muffins were bought at the door and carried in and toasted at the parlour hearth, split and buttered and stacked and kept hot under a cover or a napkin by the grate. The muffin man himself was one of the fixed figures of the winter afternoon, as much a part of the season as the lamplighter and the sweep. He came at the same hour through the frozen streets with his green baize-covered tray balanced on his head, and his handbell ringing to call the housemaids and the children to the doors, and his coming was watched for fresh muffins and crumpets toasted at the parlour hearth were among the chief pleasures of a winter tea. The muffin and the crumpet were different matters, and the household knew the difference. The muffin a soft round bread to be split and toasted and buttered, the crumpet a whole and spongy cake to be toasted whole so that the butter sank down through all its holes, and the pikelet and the tea cake besides, all of them made to be eaten hot from the flames with the butter melting into them, all of them somehow the very taste of warmth on a cold afternoon. There is a reason these things have stayed so firmly fixed in the idea of a cosy winter, for they belong to the fireside in the failing light, to the toasting fork and the glowing grate and the drawn-together family, and to eat a hot buttered crumpet by the hearth as the dark comes down is to taste a pleasure that the Victorians knew exactly as we know it, and loved for exactly the same reasons. There is scarcely a warmer or more comfortable picture in the entirety of the period than this, the failing winter afternoon outside, the drapes not yet drawn, the firelight beginning to be the brightest thing in the dimming room, the toasting fork at the coals, the smell of toast and melting butter, the tea steaming, the family close in around the hearth. The fire in this hour is doing something more than heating the chamber. It has become the gathering point, the matter the family turns its chairs and its faces toward, as the day ends, the source not only of warmth, but of glow and of a kind of companionship. To draw close to the hearth as the dark came on, to make toast at it and drink tea by it and talk in its glow, was one of the deep ordinary pleasures of Victorian life, and it is one we can still feel the pull of, because the appeal of it is bodily and simple and has not changed. A coal fire in a darkening room throws a moving orange glow and a steady heat, and people drawn in around it feel held and clustered and safe, and the tea and the hot buttered toast are the taste of that feeling, and the entire hour is a small daily festival of warmth held against the coming night. It cannot last, of course, because the night is coming on in earnest now, and the space is growing too dark to sit in by firelight alone, and the cold outside is deepening as the brief day gives out entirely. The tea things will be cleared, and the time will come to close the day's defences against the dark and the freeze, to shut the shutters and draw the heavy curtains and bring light into the place. And so we come to one of the small turning points of the winter day, the moment when the home is sealed and lit against the night, and the lamps are brought in, and the lengthy warm evening properly begins. There is a particular moment, as the winter afternoon dies, when the building turns from a place lit by the failing day to a place lit by its own flames, and it is worth standing still for, because the lighting of a Victorian house was itself a small source of heat and a ritual of its own, and the coming of the lamps marked the real beginning of the cosy evening. Outside in the street, the change is announced by a figure we should watch for, the lamplighter, going his round at dusk with his long pole, reaching up to each gas street lamp in turn to open the little tap and touch his flame to the mantle, so that one by one down the foggy street the lamps bloom into soft halos of light, marking his slow progress through the gathering dark. He came twice, the lamplighter at dusk to glow, and at some cold hour of the early morning to put out, and in the short days of deep winter his evening round began early, by the middle of the afternoon when the fog had brought on the dark before its time, so that his little blooming lights were often the first sign that the brief day had given up. There was a homely comfort in watching for him from a warm window, the figure with the pole going lamp to lamp down the darkening street, each touch of his flame leaving a soft glow behind in the murk, the lights coming on, one by one, to mark the safe shape of the street against the closing night, while indoors the lamps were being lit to answer them, and the hangings drawn against the frost he walked through. Indoors the lighting was a mixture of the new and the old, and a comfortable house of the 1870s used all of it. In the better rooms there was very likely gas, piped in from the main and burning at brackets on the wall, or in a pendant fitting over the table, lit with a taper or a match at dusk, and giving a bright, steady, faintly hissing flame behind its glass shade. Gas was the modern marvel, brighter than any candle, and though we would not call it warm, it gave off a real glow of its own, enough that a room with several gas jets burning grew perceptibly warmer for them, and enough that the gas was sometimes resented in summer for exactly that reason. Alongside the gas, and in the chambers the pipes did not reach, burned the oil lamps, the paraffin and colza lamps with their wicks and chimneys and globes, throwing a warm yellow pool of light, and these too gave off a gentle heat, that the heated glass globe of a good lamp, a matter you could hold your chilled hands near. And in the most intimate places, the bedrooms and the back stairs and the journey up to bed, there was still the oldest light of all, the candle carried about the house in its holder, its small flame leaning and recovering in the draughts of the unlit passages. Lighting, like warmth, had its grades and its costs, and a household reckoned them. The candles that lit the bedrooms and the back stairs came in two kinds, and the difference between them ran along the same line as everything else in the household. There were tallow candles made of rendered animal fat, cheap and smoky and strong-smelling, that guttered and needed their burnt wicks constantly trimmed with the snuffers lest they smoke and run, and these did for the kitchen and the servants and the lesser rooms. And there were wax candles of beeswax or the newer spermaceti and stearine, clean and bright and almost smokeless and dear, kept for the parlour and the dinner table and the eyes of guests. The very poor beneath even tallow burned the rushlight, a peeled rush dipped in fat that gave a thin failing flame for a few minutes at a time. Light was not to be wasted any more than coal was. Candle ends were saved and were often the maid's small perquisite. The snuffers were in constant use, and a household moved through the dark winter evenings carrying its light from room to room rather than lighting every chamber at once, so that much of the dwelling at any moment stood unlit and dark, the pool of candlelight following the people through the cold black passages, and the short days of winter, dark by the middle of the afternoon, and not light again till past 8, meant that the lighting of the home was a heavy and constant and carefully managed expense through all the months of the frost. Each of these flames, the gas and the lamp and the candle, was a hearth fire in miniature, and together they added their heat, small jet by small jet, to the chambers they lit, so that the lighting of the building at evening did not only push back the gloom, but raised the temperature a little, and a parlour with its fire built up and its gas lit and its lamp glowing was warmer for all three than the grate alone could make it. The bringing of the lamps was a threshold in the day, the line between afternoon and evening, and it went together with the sealing of the chamber. As the lamps were lit, the shutters were closed and barred over the black cold windows and the heavy hangings drawn across them, and in that one short sequence of actions the space changed its whole nature. A moment before it had been a place open to the dying grey day, the frost pressing at the glass. Now it was a sealed, glowing, lamplit cell of warmth. The dark and the fog and the freeze shut firmly outside the shutters, the blaze and the lamps and the assembled family within, and the evening, the best and warmest hours of the winter day, could begin in earnest. So the lamplighter passes on down the foggy street, leaving his row of soft lights behind him, and inside the household the gas is lit, and the lamps are carried in, and the shutters are drawn, and the family settles into a room that is now as snug and bright and closed against the night as the apparatus of the dwelling can make it. We have followed the glow all the way from the dead cold grate before dawn to this, the lit and sealed and glowing evening room, and now, at last, we can sit down in it, with the family drawn together and the blaze built high, and spend the lengthy winter evening by the hearth. The evening is the reward for the entire bitter day, and the home has been working since before dawn toward exactly this, a room sealed and lit and heated to its warmest, with the family gathered into it and the quiet hours of the night stretching ahead. The drawing-room after dark in deep winter, the shutters barred, the drapes drawn, the lamps glowing, and the coals built up higher than it has been all day, is the masterpiece of the household's warmth, the place where all the labour of the maid, and the range, and the coal, and the lamps finally comes together into a few hours of deep and gathered comfort, and it is here that we will settle for a while. The fire is the first thing. For the evening the grate is made up generously, fed to a tall, steady, glowing bank of coals that throws a strong and constant heat out into the place, and the family arranges itself within that heat, the chairs drawn into a loose half-circle facing the hearth, the most comfortable seats nearest the glow, the master very likely with his back to the flames or his feet toward it, the company turned inward toward the glow. The warmth of the built-up fire fills the sealed room as no daytime fire quite manages, because the shutters and curtains are holding it in and the lamps are adding their share, and the chamber reaches in these evening hours than is akin to an all-over warmth that the building ever achieves, so that even the far corners lose their edge, and a person can sit at ease without a shawl pulled tight, or a screen between them and the draught. Yet packed these in the sun. Double tattoosteris and Singapore, but in Kant Nibsmon, the Cherokee can be power to typical Talamable to the betoned him. Sivton the Frida Tollers. There was, even so, a cold paradox built into the open fire, and the furniture of the space had grown up to answer it. A fire burning in an open coal grate draws air. It must, for the draught up the chimney is what feeds the flames and carries off the smoke, and all the air that goes up the flue has to be replaced by air pulled in from the place, from under the doors, around the windows, across the floor. So the very fire that warmed your face was forever pulling a current of raw air toward itself, past you and around you, and a person sitting before a good fire might be toasted in front and chilled behind at the very same moment, warm on the shins and cold on the back of the neck, the snugness of the coals and the draught they created reaching them together. The answer, worked out over generations, was the high-backed winged armchair, That deep chair whose tall back rose above the sitter's head, and whose side wings curved forward past the cheeks, made precisely to enclose a person before the grate, to catch and hold the radiant warmth of the coals about the head and shoulders, and to shield the back and neck from the chill draught the hearth itself drew across the chamber. The old wooden settle, the high-backed bench beside the kitchen and cottage fire, did the same humbler work, its tall solid back a wall against the space's cold currents. To sink into a wing chair drawn up to the evening blaze, the wings closed warm about your head, a screen at your back was to be as completely and cleverly warmed as the age knew how to arrange, wrapped on every side against both the chill and the draught the grate could not help but make. And into that snug sealed room comes the quiet life of a winter evening, the gentle occupations that fill the hours between dinner and bed. Someone reads aloud, a novel perhaps taken chapter by chapter through the winter, the family listening in the firelight, and this was one of the great shared pleasures of the age. The household gathered to a single story in the lamplight, while the wind worked at the shutters outside. The women's hands are busy with needlework, the sewing and mending and fine work that filled their evenings, drawn close to the lamp for the lamplight, and to the blaze for the ease. There might be music, one of the daughters at the piano, the others gathered round. There might be a game of cards at a side table, or chess, or the children allowed down for an hour to sit on the hearthrug in the best comfort of all, and play some quiet game before bed. The cat is asleep against the fender. The kettle may be on the hob for a last hot drink, and drawn to the same warmth as ever are the animals of the house, for nothing finds a blaze faster than a cat or a dog on a winter's night. The cat lies stretched in the best of the heat, or curled in the warm angle of the fender, and the dog takes its place at the master's feet before the coals, and their simple animal certainty about where the glow is to be had only confirms what the family knows, that the fireside is the one good place to be. There is an old truth in that, for the hearth gathered the household not by any rule but by the plain pull of comfort and light, and the family and the children and the cat and the dog all arranged themselves around it of an evening, for the same reason, because it was snug and bright, and the heart of the place, and there was nowhere in the frozen house half so good to be. What strikes us most, looking in at it, is how completely the snugness and the glow have drawn the family together into a single small space. There is no scattering to separate heated rooms, because there are no other heated rooms. The heat is here, in this one sealed glowing chamber, and so the family is here, all of them, in the firelight, within a few feet of one another, and of the coals for the entire length of the evening. The cold of the rest of the house, the dark unlit dining room, the frozen stairs, the bedrooms with their reforming frost, presses in all around this one bright cell, and the family sits close at its centre, gathered by the very scarcity of the comfort into a closeness that our evenly heated and widely scattered modern households have rather lost. The hearth pulled people in. It made a small, snug island, and on that island, every bitter night, the family was gathered into one chamber and one circle of light, and that gathering was as much the point of the hearth as the heat itself. This is the picture the day has been building toward, and it is worth holding for a moment in its fullness. The deep glowing fire, the lamps, the drawn curtains, family close in their half circle, the book, or the music, or the quiet game, the glow at last filling the sealed room, the bitter night shut out beyond the shutters. It is the Victorian winter evening at its best and its most longed for, and it is the reason for all the cold early labour, the maid's dark dawn and the coalman's load and the carried cans and the endless climbing stairs. All of it was so that this hour could exist, the family cosy and gathered and at peace by the grate, while the winter raged unheard outside. And from here, as the evening wears on, and the coals begins at last to be let down, the household will turn toward the hardest passage of the winter day, the leaving of this snug, bright room for the unlit cold journey up to bed. Before the family goes up to the frozen bedrooms, there is for some of them one more warm ritual to be had, and it is among the most luxurious and the most laborious that the house provides, the hot bath taken in winter before the sleeping room grate. We must not imagine a bathroom. This house has none, or at most a raw and rudimentary one little used in winter. The winter bath was taken in the bedchamber, in front of the grate, in a portable tub filled by hand with hot water carried up from the range below, and the business was a small triumph of warmth wrung out of a freezing house at considerable cost in someone's labour. The tub itself was the hip bath or the sponge bath, a shallow portable bath of japanned tin or zinc, shaped so that a person sat in it with the water about the hips, brought into the sleeping room and set down on a mat before the hearth. And then began the carrying, for the bath had to be filled, and every drop of the water came up from the basement, heated in the great boiler at the side of the range, dipped out into the tall covered cans, and carried up flight after flight by the maid, can after can, to be poured steaming into the tub. To fill even a shallow bath this way took several journeys up the entire height of the house with a heavy can of hot water, and so a hot bath was a real event, an indulgence that cost a servant a good deal of stair climbing, and not a business undertaken lightly or often in the depth of winter. The hot bath, then, was the rare indulgence, and the daily reality of washing was a far colder affair. Most washing, most days, was done at the washstand in the bedchamber, in icy water or in the little that a single carried can could warm, a quick icy sponge and scrub at the basin, in a room where the breath smoked, done fast, because the cold gave no encouragement to linger. And there were those, a good many of them, who made a positive virtue of the freeze, for the age had a powerful strain of belief in the bracing, hardening, health-giving properties of icy water, and many a Victorian, master and schoolboy and hardy spinster alike, began the winter day on principle with a cold sponge down or a plunge into a tub of frankly icy water, gasping and slapping themselves pink in the freezing room, convinced that the shock of it fortified the constitution against chills and weakness and moral softness alike. The icy wash was thought manly, wholesome, character-forming. The hot bath, by contrast, carried a faint air of indulgence and luxury, a matter for the old, the ailing, and the soft. So the steaming hip bath before the sleeping-room grate was the exception, longed for and laboured over and rarely had, while the ordinary winter morning began, for most of the household, with the small daily ordeal of icy water in a chilly room, met and got over as quickly as the body could manage. But for the person who took it, the winter bath before the bedroom grate was a pocket of pure warmth carved in from the frost, and the arrangements all served to make the most of it, and to guard against the chill that waited a foot beyond the firelight. The grate was built up so that the flames threw its heat across the tub and the bather. The towels were hung on a horse or over the fender to warm through before they were wanted, so that one came out of the hot water not into a cold rough cloth but into a warmed one. A screen might be set to hold the hearth's heat close and block the draught from the door, and within that small defended zone of warmth, the firelight on the water, the steam rising, the heated towels waiting, the bather had for a few minutes a comfort as complete as the cold house could offer, the glow of the blaze on one side and the comfort of the water all around. It could not be lingered in, for the water cooled fast in the icy air of the chamber, and the snugness was a borrowed and temporary thing, the glow of the carried cans and the built-up fire holding back the frost of the bedroom, only for as long as both lasted. So the bath was quick and hot and then over, the bather stepping out into the heated towel and into the grate's direct heat, drying fast and getting at once into the heated nightclothes, the matter a brief steaming island in the surrounding chill. And when it was done, there was the other side of the labour to come, the bath to be emptied as it had been filled, the cooling water dipped or carried out, can by can, or by tipping and bailing, down all the stairs again, so that the few minutes of the master's or the mistress's warm bath stood on a quarter hour of the maid's climbing before and after. It is a small matter, the winter bath, but it gathers up in one picture everything we have been learning about how this house kept snug, the heat made at the one great fire below and carried up the stairs by hand to wherever it was wanted, the careful building of a defended zone of warmth, the warm towels and the built-up fire and the screen against the draught, the borrowed temporary nature of all of it, warm only while the borrowed heat lasted, and the human labour standing behind every minute of comfort. And it brings us to the edge of the night, for the bath is taken in preparation for bed, and now the lamps are burning low, and the blaze is being let down, and the time has come for the entire household to face the coldest journey of the day, to climb up the freezing stairs to the frost-ferned bedrooms, and the warming, somehow, of a freezing bed in a freezing room for the night ahead. Before we follow the family up to bed, go down once more, all the way to the basement, because there is a truth about warmth in this house that we have touched on, but not yet looked at squarely, and the end of the day is the moment it shows most plainly. We have seen that the kitchen, with its ever-burning range, was the warmest room in the building. What we have not yet faced is the full strangeness of that fact, that the heat of the house ran in almost exactly the reverse of its grandeur, so that the higher and finer the space, the colder it was likely to be, and the lower and humbler, the warmer. Think of the house as a column of heat, and see how it was arranged. At the bottom, in the basement, was the range, and around it the kitchen and the servants' hall. And these rooms held the steadiest warmth in the building, the range never going out, the comfort thrown off by all that cooking filling the low kitchen, so that below stairs, where the servants lived and worked, there was a constant reliable warmth that the family's own quarters, with their occasional lit-and-let-die fires, never quite matched. The servants' hall, where the staff took their meals and sat in their brief hours of rest, was, simply, snug. The kitchen was hot. The whole basement world of the house was, in the matter of heat at least, the most comfortable place to be, and the family above, in their marble drawing-room, were often colder than their cook. And the glow of the kitchen was the servants' own in the evening, the one real compensation of the lengthy hard day. When the family's dinner had gone up, and the worst of the work was done, the staff gathered round the range they spent the day tending around the kitchen hearth or in the servants' hall, and there, in the warmest room in the house, they took their own supper and their own brief rest. There was the cook's chair by the range, and very often the high-backed settle drawn up to the blaze, and the great kitchen table, and in that close, reliable heat the servants mended their clothes and drank their tea and talked over the day, the kitchen at evening becoming a snug and sociable place, quite unlike the grand freezing halls above. It was the upside of the strange geography of the house, that the people who had no fire in their bedrooms and slept cold under the roof at least passed their working days and their evening hours in the one chamber that was never allowed to go cold, gathered round the iron heart of the house in a warmth. The family, scattered and waited upon in their separate chilly grandeur above, did not always share. There is a last irony in it worth a moment's thought. The family, for all their coal and their many fires, took their warmth in a scattered and solitary way, a hearth fire here and a blaze there, each person often alone in a separately heated room, the grandeur of the house, spreading them thin through its cold spaces. The servants, with no fire of their own to sit by, took theirs all together in the one warm kitchen, gathered close round the single great heat of the range. And of the two it was not always clear who had the better of it, the master alone in his large unheated study with his single grate, or the servants packed snug and companionable round the kitchen hearth below. For warmth shared in company has a quality that heat taken alone in a grand chilly room does not, and the snug, crowded kitchen, whatever else it lacked, did not lack for that. But climb the column to the top, and the comfort runs out entirely. Up above the family's floors, up past the nursery, under the slope of the roof, were the attic bedrooms where the servants slept, and these were the coldest rooms in the entire house, colder even than the family's frost-ferned bedrooms, because they were directly under the cold roof, and because they never, ever had a hearth fire. Not for the maid, not for the cook, not for any of them. A fire in a servant's bedroom was an extravagance almost unheard of, the coal too dear, and the custom too settled. And so the people who spent the day making and tending and carrying the household's fires went up at night to sleep in unheated garrets under the freezing slates, with the frost on the inside of their own small windows, and no warmth but what they carried up in their own bodies and their own thin blankets. So the geography of warmth in this house was very nearly upside down. The heat was made at the bottom and gathered by labour toward the family in the middle, and the people who made and carried it slept at the top in the frost. The cook was snug by day and freezing by night. The maid spent her day in the heat of other people's hearths and her night in a fireless attic. The family enjoyed their built-up evening grate and then climbed, themselves, to frigid bedrooms, but never so frozen as the chambers above them. It was not thought cruel, particularly. It was simply the order of things, heat following money and rank in the daytime rooms and abandoning everyone alike more or less at night. But it is worth seeing clearly, because it tells us that the heating of the Victorian house was not a tide that filled the entire building evenly. It was a business made in one place and moved to another by human effort, and where the effort stopped, the cold simply took over, and the effort stopped every night at the doors of the people who had spent all day making the glow for everybody else. Carry that knowledge gently with you as we go back up now, past the family's floors, to watch the oldest and most intimate problem of the winter house being solved at last. The warming, against all the odds, of an icy bed in a freezing room, so that the household, family and servants alike can climb at last out of the chill and into sleep. And so we come to the hardest passage of the winter day, the one the warm evening has been quietly dreading, the leaving of the glowing sealed drawing room for the frozen dark climb to bed. The lamps are carried out, all but the one that lights the way. The hearth in the grate is being let down, and one by one the household takes up a candle and goes out of the warm chamber into the freezing house, up the freezing stairs, along the chill corridor, to bedrooms that have lain unheated and frost-ferned through the evening. The contrast is brutal, out of the close heat of the evening hearth into air that bites at once, and the candle flame leaning hard in the draught of the stairwell as you climb. This was the moment every winter's night turned on, and the house had its remedies ready, the small ancient arts of warming a bed. The grandest of them, and the oldest, was the warming pan. This is a wide, shallow pan of brass or copper, lidded and pierced with holes, on a long wooden handle, and into it were put hot embers and glowing coals from the coals. And then a servant carried it upstairs and passed it briskly between the cold sheets, running it up and down the bed, lid closed, never letting it rest in one place lest it scorch the linen, so that the heat of the coals drove the icy damp out of the sheets and left them, for a few minutes at least, warm to climb into. The warming pan was a matter of some danger and some skill, for a pan left a moment too long would brown or burn the bed, and by this period it was beginning to give way to safer methods, but it lingered, especially in the country and the older households. The brass pan hung by the kitchen hearth and taken up last thing to take the worst of the chill off the master's and mistress's bed. The safer and increasingly common remedy was the bottle, the stoneware hot water bottle that did the same work with hot water instead of fire. These were heavy vessels of glazed stoneware, fat and rounded, that the household sometimes called with affection the pig, an old word for a round earthen pot that the shape seemed to suit, and they were filled at bedtime with hot water from the range, stoppered tight, wrapped in a piece of flannel so they would not scald, and put down into the bed at the foot, where they held their heat for hours, and gave a person something warm to set the feet against through the night. A stone pig wrapped in flannel at the bottom of the bed was, for a great many people, the difference between a bitter night and a bearable one, and it stayed warm long after the hearth and the warming pan had done their work and died. And below these, in the humbler reaches of the house, and among those who had neither pan nor pig, was the oldest remedy of all, the heated stone or brick. A common brick or a smooth stone was set in the oven of the range, or by the hearth through the evening, until it was thoroughly hot, and then wrapped in a cloth or an old piece of flannel, carried up and put into the bed, holding its heat slowly through the frozen hours, a poor person's hot water bottle that cost nothing but the warming. There were older and odder warmers besides, kept in this corner of the country or that. There was the device some called the monk, a wooden frame built to sit in the bed and hold a small pot or pan of hot coals safely away from the sheets. An open fire carried into the bed itself behind a wooden guard. There were smooth soapstones heated at the blaze and slipped into the bed, holding their warmth long and gently. There were bags of salt or of cherry stones or of sand heated through and laid against chilled feet. And there was the oldest warmer of all, the living one, the cat or the small dog taken up into the bed for the sake of its warm body, or the children bedded together to share their heat. For there is no warmer thing in a freezing bed than another living creature, and many a child, through many a long-running winter, slept warm chiefly because a brother or a sister, or the household cat, lay curled against them under the heaped blankets. The servant climbing to her fireless attic might take a wrapped hot brick from the kitchen range up with her, the one piece of the day's warmth she was allowed to carry to her own icy bed, and set it at her feet under the thin blanket, and be glad of it. There was for many one last warming to be taken before the freezing bed was faced, and it was taken from the inside. A hot drink last thing, carried up or made at the dying parlour fire, or the final defence of the day against the chill of the night, and it went by the very name we still use for the matter put on the head, the nightcap. It might be a cup of hot milk, or a posset, or for the adults a hot toddy of spirits and sugar and hot water, or a glass of something mulled and spiced, taken slowly in the heated room, or carried up to be drunk in bed, a small inner fire, lit against the long frozen hours ahead. To go up to a frozen bedroom with the snugness of a hot drink inside you, the wrapped brick or the stone pig waiting at the foot of the bed, was to meet the night with every defence the house could give, but warmed without by the heated sheets, and within by the last hot drink of the day. So the freezing bed was met, each according to the household's means and station, with pan or pig or brick, with fire heat or water heat or stone heat, all of them ways of carrying a little of the day's warmth up into the freezing bedroom and trapping it for a few hours among the sheets. None of it warmed the place. The air of the bedroom stayed bitter, the frost stayed on the glass. What these things warmed was the bed itself, the small enclosed nest a body would lie in, so that the sleeper, climbing fast in from the frozen air and under the covers, found not an icy hollow but a patch of held warmth waiting, and could draw the bedclothes up and settle into the one warm place in the whole unheated upper house, and begin, at last, to be snug enough to sleep. Climb into the bed, then, because the bed itself was the final and most perfect of all the house's solutions to the frost, the place where, when everything else had failed, and the fires were out, and the chambers had surrendered to the frost, a person could still be snug, and it was built and dressed and managed with exactly that in mind. The Victorian bed in winter was not a flat thing to lie upon. It was an enclosure, a nest, an architecture of layers and curtains designed to trap and hold the heat of the body through the coldest night. And to lie in it and understand it is to understand the last secret of keeping warm in such a house. Begin with the bed itself and its hangings. A good bed in this period very often had its curtains, and these were not merely for show. Drawn round at night, they made of it a closed little room within the freezing one, a fabric box that held the sleeper's warmth close and shut out the draughts, crossing the chamber, so that inside the hangings the air grew snug with the body's own heat, while the chamber beyond stayed frozen. To pull them to on a bitter night was to seal yourself into the smallest and most defensible refuge the house contained, and people rested the better for it. The grandest of these kept the full 4 posts and a high tester overhead. More usual by this date was the half-tester, hung at the head alone, giving much of the same shelter with less of the weight and the dust. And the plainer rooms and the servants' attics had none, and made do. But the very efficiency of the closed bed drew a long medical quarrel, for some physicians insisted that shut hangings bred disease by holding a stale, much-breathed air about the face all night, while others thought the open draught of the chamber the greater danger to the constitution. In the depth of January, most sleepers settled it in favour of comfort, and left the argument to the milder months. Then the bedding, layer on deliberate layer. Beneath the sleeper, very often, a feather bed, a great soft sack of feathers laid on the mattress that the body sank into and that closed warmly up around it. A bed had to be dry as well as warm, and the dread of the damp bed ran deep, for a bed that had stood unused and unaired in an unheated room grew damp with the moisture of the air, and to sleep in damp sheets was held, with good reason, to be a true danger to health, a way to catch a chill or a fever or worse, and many a traveller's death was laid at the door of a damp-in bed. So the airing of beds was a serious duty. A bed in daily use was turned back and aired each morning before the bedchamber grate. A bed in a spare room kept for a guest was aired for days before the visitor came, the sheets taken down and warmed and dried at the flames, the bed passed over with the warming pan, as much to drive out the damp as to drive in the heat, for the warming pan's first and oldest purpose was as much to dry the bed as to warm it. The careful housemaid knew the state of every bed in her charge, and a guest shown to a well-run spare room found the bed not only warmed at that hour, but aired and dried over days, the damp coaxed out of it at the hearth, so that the comfort waiting in the sheets was a dry warmth safe to sink into, and not the treacherous clammy chill of a bed left to the freeze. Over the sleeper, sheets of linen or cotton, and then the blankets, wool blankets, 2 or 3 or more of them in the depth of winter, and over the blankets the eiderdown, that quilt stuffed with down so light and so snug, and over all the counterpane. The weight of it was considerable, and the glow of it, once the bed had been heated, and the body had lain in it long enough to fill it with heat, was complete, a deep enclosing warmth that the chill of the space could not reach through. The bed was a heat trap of the most effective kind, and a well-made winter bed, curtained and feathered and blanketed and quilted, with the pig warm at the foot, was as warm a place as existed anywhere in the Victorian world, and the sleeper went into it dressed for warmth as carefully as they had dressed for the day. The nightgown or nightshirt of thick flannel or thick cotton, long to the feet, the nightcap on the head to stop the snugness escaping where it escaped most, tied under the chin, were worn by men and women and children alike against the chill of the bedroom air on the one part of them that lay outside the covers. Bed socks of knitted wool on chilled feet. Perhaps a bed jacket round the shoulders for anyone who sat up over a book by a candle before sleep. Wrapped in flannel, capped, socked, the warm pig at the feet, the curtains drawn and the weight of blanket and eiderdown over all. The sleeper lay in a deep enclosed warmth, while a foot away beyond the curtains the place was frozen enough to freeze the water in the ewer. This was the final triumph of the winter house, and it is a quiet and a humble one. They could not keep the spaces heated through the night. The fires went out. The frost crept back. The frost returned to the glass. But they could keep the bed snug, and into that small curtained feathered nest the household climbed at the day's end, each in their own family and servant, the master under his eiderdown, and the maid under her thin blanket with her wrapped brick, all of them solving the same ancient problem, the same ancient way, by making of the bed a warm enclosed hollow and sealing themselves into it against the frost. And there at last, snug enough, the house dark and the fires dying and the frost gathering once more on every pane, they slept. But the house does not simply fall asleep all at once, and there is a last task to be done before the day is truly over, the putting to bed of the fires themselves, which was as much a nightly ritual as the warming of the beds and quite as important, for a fire left wrong overnight could either die uselessly and waste the morning, or, far worse, throw a coal onto the hearthrug in the small hours and burn the house down. So before the household sleeps, the grates must be seen to, banked and guarded and made safe, and the doing of it is the gentle closing movement of the entire day of warmth. In the chambers that are finished with for the night, the dining room, the drawing room, the hearth is simply let die, but not left to chance. The maid, on her last round, rakes the burning coals together, clears the worst of the loose cinders that might roll, and sets the fire guard across the front of the grate, that framework of mesh or bars that stands sentry over the dying fire through the night, so that no spark or falling coal can reach the rug or the boards while the house sleeps unwatched. Then she draws the grate down and leaves it to burn itself slowly out behind its guard, the glowing bank slowly dimming to red, and then to the deep dull glow of embers, and then by the small hours to grey ash and dark, the heat ebbing out of it and out of the chamber as the night deepens. But the one hearth that matters most, the range below, is not let die, and the banking of the range for the night was the most important fire task of the 24 hours. The kitchen maid or the cook, last thing, does to the range what was done before the very first dawn we watched, banks it down to sleep without letting it go out. The fire is raked down low and then covered, smothered deliberately with a thick layer of small coal, slack and ash, packed over the glowing core so that the air can barely reach it, and the dampers are closed down to choke the draught, so that the blaze, starved of air, does not burn but only smoulders. The merest red heart kept barely alive under its blanket of ash, using almost no fuel, holding just enough life that in the black raw morning the kitchen maid can rake the blanket off, open the dampers, feed it, and wake it back to roaring life without having to light it cold from nothing. The banked range is the seed of tomorrow's warmth, the one ember the house keeps burning all night so that the whole cycle can begin again at dawn. There is something very old in this nightly covering of the coals, older than the house, older than the range, older than the word Victorian itself. In the centuries when towns were built of timber, and a loose fire at night could burn a whole street to the ground, the covering of the household fire after dark had been a matter of law, and of the ringing of a bell, the evening bell that told every house to cover or put out its fire against the dangers of the night. That bell and that duty came down through the centuries under the old French name for the matter it ordered, the cover fire, the curfew. And though the word had long since drifted away from its first meaning, the act itself survived unbroken, night after night, century after century, in exactly this homely task. The kitchen maid banking her range under its blanket of ash and slack, choking the dampers down, leaving the one red ember to smoulder safe till morning, was performing without knowing it one of the oldest continuous rituals of domestic life, the covering of the flames against the night, that her forebears had performed at the sound of the curfew bell 500 years before. And so the fires go down across the house one by one, the bright evening grate dimming behind its guard, the lamps put out, the candles carried up and snuffed, and only the banked range smouldering on in the dark basement, the single surviving spark of all the day's warmth. The house cools. With the fires dying and the lamps out and the family in their beds, there is nothing more to make heat against the freeze, and the freeze, which the household has held back all day at such cost, begins at once and silently to return, seeping back into the spaces the fires had warmed, reclaiming the dining room and the drawing room and the stairs, settling once more into the stone and the boards and the still air, while the family sleeps on, warm only in their curtained beds, small islands of held heat in a house going cold around them. There is something almost solemn in it, the deliberate nightly surrender of the comfort, the guarding of the dying fires, the banking of the one that must not die, the cooling of the whole carefully heated house back toward the temperature of the winter outside. All day the household had pushed the cold back, fire by fire, can by can, and now, at night, with everyone safe in their warm beds, it let the cold come back in, holding only the beds and the one banked range against it, and slept, while the frost crept once more across the inside of every darkened pane. So the house passes into the deep middle of the winter night, and the freeze comes fully back into it, and there is a strange quiet beauty in this hour that is worth staying awake just long enough to see before we too let go. With the last fire guarded and dying, and the family long asleep in their curtained beds, the building gives itself over to the winter, and room by unlit room, the glow that was made and carried and guarded through the whole day drains away into the frozen air, until the house stands once more in the small hours, very nearly as frozen as the road it shelters in. Move through it in the dark and feel the frost reclaiming its ground. In the drawing room where the family sat so snug a few hours ago, the hearth behind its guard is grey ash now, the last red gone out of it, and the space is chilling fast, the heat sinking out through the shutters and the curtains and the walls, the marble of the chimney-piece cold again to the touch. On the stairs the biting air pools and deepens. In the dining room the comfort of the evening is a memory, and on the windows all over the house the frost is coming back, the same branching ferns of ice we saw at the very beginning of this long day reforming silently on the inside of the darkened glass, pane by pane, as the chambers lose the last of their heat, and the moisture in the air freezes once more against the frost, the house drawing its winter pattern across its own windows in the dark while everyone sleeps. The cold of the deep night announced itself in small ways to anyone awake to hear them. The house itself spoke as it cooled, the timbers and the joinery contracting in the falling temperature with sudden sharp ticks and cracks in the dark, the small reports of a building shrinking in the frost, that a wakeful child might lie and listen to and wonder at. Down in the basement the cat had long since left the cooling rooms, and curled itself as close as it could get to the banked range, the one warm thing left in the house, drawn to it as everything living was drawn to the surviving ember. In a sick room, if the house held one, a single fire might be kept burning through the night, and a nurse might sit the freezing hours through beside it, feeding it quietly, the one waking soul in the sleeping frozen house. And by the time the night was at its deepest, the water in every bedroom ewer had frozen over again as it had at the start. The milk left out had a cap of ice, the frost had reclaimed every pane, and the house had come full circle, back to the very cold it had begun, the day fighting, waiting in the dark for the alarm in the housemaid's head and the first struck match of the morning to begin the long warm labour all over again. Only two kinds of warmth survive the night, and both are small and enclosed. There are the beds, the curtained feathered nests where the sleepers lie, each one a pocket of held body heat in a frozen unlit room, the stone pig still faintly warm at the foot, the breath snug within the drawn hangings. The only warmth in all the upper house gathered into these few small hollows where the people are. And there is the banked range below, smouldering its barely living red heart under its blanket of ash in the raw air basement, the one hearth in the house that is not allowed to die, holding through the freezing hours the single spark from which all of tomorrow's warmth will have to be rebuilt. Everything else has gone icy. The day's heat has been spent and surrendered, and the winter has the house again. And this, when you stand back from it, is the deep rhythm of the whole thing. The truth that all the fires and flannel and carried cans and warmed beds were only ever moments within, the great daily tide of heat rising and falling against the constant pressure of the frost. Every winter morning the house stood cold, and all day long human hands made it warm, fire by fire, and every night the snugness was let go again, and the freeze returned, and the next morning it all began once more, the dead grates, the dark kneeling maid, the first struck match, the slow reconquest of the house from the frost. The warmth was never a possession. It was a labour, renewed every single day against a cold that never gave up and never went away. A business made each morning and lost each night and made again, all through the deepening winter, by people who never expected it to be otherwise. The house lies raw and quiet now under the hard frost, the frost ferns spreading once more across the black glass, the family asleep in their warm beds, the range smouldering on alone below. In a few hours, in the black before dawn, the alarm will sound in the housemaid's own head, and she will rise in the freezing attic, and go down in the dark with her candle and her matches, and kneel at the first cold grate, and it will all begin again. But that is hours away yet, and there is no need to think of it now. For now the house simply sleeps, snug where it matters, in the beds, holding its one banked ember against the night, and we can let it be, and turn at last towards sleep ourselves. Before we do, let us hold the whole of it together for a moment, the entire winter day we have travelled through, because seen all at once it tells us something about these people and their lives that no single part of it quite does on its own. We have followed the snugness of this house from the dead cold grate before dawn to the warmed bed at midnight, through the lit fires and the carried coal and the roaring range, the layered flannel and the drawn curtains, the toast at the hearth and the lamp-lit evening, and the wrapped pig at the foot of the bed, and through all of it, behind all of it, the steady human labour that made it, and the steady human cost that paid for it. And what it amounts to, in the end, is a way of life built around a fire, in a way that we, who have forgotten the frost, can only just imagine. For the great difference between their winter and ours is not really the technology, the grates and ranges and warming pans against our pipes and switches. It is worth saying, too, that the British clung to their open fires by choice as much as by custom, and that this was a matter foreigners found strange. Across much of the colder continent the closed stove had long since won, the tall tiled or iron stove that burned its fuel shut away behind a door and threw a steady, even warmth into the whole room, far more efficient than the open grate, far less wasteful of heat up the chimney, far better at warming a space through. The English knew of these stoves, and mostly would not have them. They thought them stuffy and close and somehow joyless, a warmth without a soul, and they preferred, stubbornly, their open coal fire with all its waste and all its draught, because they wanted not merely heat but a fire, a visible living flame to sit before, a glowing focus to gather round, a hearth in the old full sense. A foreign visitor might find an English room cold and ill-heated, and marvel that so practical a people would not adopt so obvious an improvement. The English would have answered, if they troubled to answer at all, that a closed stove was not a fire, and that a house without a fire to sit at was no true home, that bare grate was inefficient and draughty and dirty, and they loved it, and kept it, and built the whole feeling of domestic life around it. It is that for them warmth was scarce and effortful and visible, and therefore valued in a way that our easy and visible comfort can never quite be. They knew where their heat came from, because they had carried it up the stairs. They knew what it cost, because they had paid for the coal and swept the flue and felt the frost of the chambers it could not reach. They gathered close around it, because it was scarce enough that there was only one warm chamber to gather in, and that gathering, the family drawn into the one fire-lit circle on the winter evening, was at the very centre of how they understood a home, so much so that the word for the fireplace, the hearth, became simply another word for home itself. That is the thing worth carrying away from this long imagined day, the meaning the grate had over and above its heat. In a house where warmth had to be made fresh each morning and gathered into a few rooms and guarded all day against the freeze, the hearth was not a convenience. It was the heart, in the old full sense, the centre the household formed itself around, the place the family came together at the day's end, the warm point at the middle of the frost, and the keeping of it was bound up with the keeping of the home and the keeping of the people in it, cosy and fed and alive through the winter. To tend a fire well, to keep a good hearth, to gather your people around it in the evening, was very near to the whole Victorian idea of domestic life, and all the brass and marble and ritual that surrounded the fireplace was the outward sign of how much it meant. And there was the cost, which we have not flinched from and should not forget now at the end, the maid's dark labour and aching hands, the coalman's load, the servant's fireless attic, the soot and the fog over the city, and the children who for so long had climbed the flues in the dark. The warmth was real, and it was beautiful, and it was deeply human, and it was also bought, every day, at a price that fell hardest on those who had least. And a true account of the Victorian hearth has to hold both of those things at once, the glow and the cost, the gathered family and the climbing stairs, without letting go of either. They are not separate stories. They are the same fire, seen from the warm chair and from the freezing cellar, and the whole of it together is what it really meant to keep warm in a Victorian winter. We should not leave this warm house tonight without remembering, gently, those for whom such warmth was only a business glimpsed through a window. The comfortable family we have spent the day with had coal by the ton and fires in each chamber, and a household to tend them. But a great many people in the same cold city had a single room, and in it a single small grate, and a daily reckoning over how much coal they could spare to burn in it, and some had less than that. A fire might be lit only in the evening, or only to cook, or, in the hardest weeks when work was short and coal was dear, hardly at all, the family going to bed in the early dark simply to be out of the frost under what coverings they had. For these households warmth was not the steady background of life that it was in the house we have visited. It was a scarce and costly thing, hoarded and rationed, and sometimes done without, and the cold was not an enemy held off in the next room, but a constant presence shared with. The glowing hearth at the centre of the comfortable home was real, and it was also across the same city, a thing many looked on from the freeze, and a true memory of the Victorian winter holds room for both. So that is where we have been tonight, all the way through one freezing day in one warm house, from the frost on the dawn window to the frost returning on the midnight glass. And now there is not a thing left to do, but let the blaze of it all burn down in your own mind, and follow the household into sleep, and let the long warm evening we have spent together come gently to its close. Let everything we have built tonight grow soft and dim now, the way the banked fire dims behind its guard, the edges of it going gentle and indistinct as the house settles into the deep of its winter night. There is nothing more for you to do, nowhere to go, no more to carry. The fires are guarded, the beds are snug, the whole long labour of the day is done, and the house lies safe and quiet under the frost, and you can let the last of it go, the carried cans and the climbing stairs, the lamplit room and the toast at the hearth, all of it sinking down now into the snug dark like coals settling in a grate. Picture yourself, if you like, in the warmest place in all of it, in one of those curtained, feathered, blanketed beds, the heavy bedclothes drawn up, the stone hot at your feet, the curtains drawn close around so that the bite of the place cannot reach you, and within them only the deep enclosed warmth of the bed and your own slow breathing. The frost may spread across the black glass beyond the curtains. It does not matter now. The fires may die down to ash through the small hours. It does not matter now. You are snug where it counts, sealed into the small held warmth of the bed the way the whole household is, the way people have kept themselves warm against the winter night for longer than any of us can remember, and there is nothing to do but lie still in it and let yourself grow heavier and warmer and slower, and let sleep come up around you like the comfort in a long lane bed. There is no need to keep hold of any of it. You do not have to remember the order of the maid's mourning, or the grades of the coal, or the names of the warmers and the layers. Let all of it loosen and drift and settle, the way the heat of a fire spreads out and softens at the edges and finally fades to an even gentle glow. The whole long day is behind you now, the cold dawn and the lit fires and the carried water and the gathered evening, and it has brought you here, to the warm dark of the bed at the end of it, which is the only place left to be. Let your breathing slow, let the snugness gather and hold. Let the small sounds of the cooling house, the tick of the settling timbers, the shift of a coal behind its guard, grow as distant and unimportant as the frost spreading silently across the dark glass. Nothing you need attend to, asking anything of you. Only the far-off sounds of a warm house, keeping itself safe through a winter night, while you sink down and down towards sleep. If this evening by the hearth was a comfort to you, and if you would like to come back to more of these quiet nights in other rooms and other ages, you are always welcome to stay a while longer in this company. There is no hurry, and nothing you need do tonight but rest. These are real histories, gathered and pieced together with care from the lives of people who truly knelt at those cold grates and carried that hot water up those stairs and slept in those curtained beds, and there will always be another evening, another house, another fire to sit beside when the nights draw in and you want somewhere warm to go. The door stays open. You will know the way back, but not tonight. Tonight the work is over, and the blaze is banked, and the bed is snug, and there is nothing left between you and sleep. Let the house go dark around you. Let the frost do its quiet work on the windows. Let the warmth you have gathered hold you, deep under the blankets, far from the cold, while the long winter night keeps watch outside and asks not a thing of you. The entire house is sleeping now. It is time for you to sleep as well. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.